Hello, friends. Get comfortable. Because tonight we're stepping into an English country mansion somewhere in the autumn of 1874, into everything it actually took to prepare one single night's rest for one wealthy woman sleeping soundly upstairs. A brass warming pan filled with hot coals swept slowly across sheets so that the first chill would already be gone the moment she slipped beneath them. A housemaid 3 floors above her, in an attic room with no fire at all, who spent nearly an hour making sure that one single bedroom stayed warm through the night. A jug of water already steaming by the washstand before she even climbed the stairs, carried up by hands she would likely never think to thank. Tonight holds a great many more of these, folded quietly into one single, very ordinary, very extraordinary night of sleep in a Victorian mansion. If a story like this one has ever helped you drift off, leaving a like and subscribing helps this little channel find someone else who needs it too. It costs nothing, and it means more than you might think. All right, love. Let your hands rest. Let your shoulders drop. Let us begin. It is not yet 9 in the evening, and somewhere in the English countryside, in a house built from grey stone and old money, a bedroom is being made ready for a woman who has not yet walked through its door. A housemaid named Sarah kneels at the grate, clearing yesterday's ash and laying fresh coal, and within a few minutes the fire catches properly, orange light spreading across the far corner of a room that was cold and still only half an hour ago. The room itself has already been swept and dusted earlier in the day, the washstand wiped clean, the whole space made ready the way it is made ready every single evening, quietly, without anyone downstairs giving it a second thought. The bed is where the real work of the evening lives, and it deserves a moment, because everything about it exists for one purpose only, to give one particular woman the best possible night's sleep money and skill can arrange. Beneath the sheets sits a mattress built in careful layers, firm horsehair at the base, soft wool above that, and on top of it all a feather bed proper, an enormous quilted sack of goose down that Sarah punches and turns now, working her fists into it the way you might knead dough, because in a few minutes a woman's whole weight will sink into it, and it needs to rise back up soft and even to receive her. The bottom sheet going on next is fine Irish linen, washed so many times over the years that it has gone soft in a way new fabric never quite achieves, cool at first touch and warming almost instantly once skin meets it, which is exactly what will happen to the woman who climbs into this bed within the hour. Over the sheets go 2 wool blankets, and over those a quilted silk counterpane in deep wine red, patterned faintly with vines that catch the firelight, chosen because a wealthy woman's bed is meant to be beautiful to look at as well as warm to lie in. Last of all come the bed curtains, heavy green damask hung on a wooden frame above the bed, ready to be drawn close around her later and turn this one corner of the room into something smaller and warmer still, a private sealed pocket of heat built specifically around a sleeping body. Before the counterpane goes on, Sarah reaches for a long-handled brass warming pan filled with hot coals and runs it in slow sweeps beneath the top sheet, up near where the pillows will sit, down toward the foot of the bed, so that by the time its owner actually lies down, the chill will already be gone and the linen will meet her skin already warm. 2 pillows go on next, propped at a slight angle against a firm bolster, tilted just enough to invite someone to sit up and read for a while, before finally sliding down into sleep. Over at the washstand, hot water waits in a china jug, steam still faintly rising, a folded towel and a cake of soap beside it. A lamp sits ready on the bedside table, its wick already trimmed, along with a single candle for later. A book chosen earlier in the day waits within easy reach, and on the floor near the dressing table a pair of soft slippers sit exactly where a pair of feet will land come morning. Every single object in this room right now is waiting for one woman, arranged so that when she finally arrives, there will be nothing left for her to want. Downstairs, that woman is finishing a letter. Her name, in our story tonight, is Margaret, and she is 34 years old. Tonight has been an ordinary evening, tea at 6:30, a little time at the piano played only for herself, and now this last letter to a sister in Bath, the pen scratching steadily across paper in the lamplit quiet of the small sitting room she prefers to the grander drawing room down the hall, She seals it, sets it aside for the morning post and glances at the clock. Nearly 9. She rises, smooths her skirt out of pure habit, and makes her way toward the staircase. The air grows noticeably cooler as she climbs, the warmth of the ground floor giving way, step by step, to the quieter chill of the upper landing, where a single lamp burns low against the wallpaper. Her lady's maid, Ellen, is already waiting outside the bedroom door, and there is an easy familiarity between the two women, built across 11 years of exactly this same nightly routine. Ellen opens the door and Margaret steps into a room that has been entirely transformed since she saw it that morning. Warmth reaches her first, the fire steady and glowing in the corner where an hour ago there was only cold stone. The lamp throws a soft circle of light across the bed, across the deep red counterpane, across the pillows arranged at their inviting angle. She feels the change in temperature the instant she crosses the threshold, and something in her shoulders, tense without her quite realizing it, begins to loosen. She does not think consciously about the fire that had to be built, or the water that had to be carried up 3 flights of stairs, or the hour Sarah just spent making this room exactly this warm. She simply feels comfortable and glad to be here, which is, in a house like this one, rather the entire point. Ellen begins undressing her, and this part of the evening moves quickly, practiced hands working through hooks and laces the two women barely need to discuss anymore. The outer gown comes off first. The corset follows, and Margaret exhales more fully the moment the laces loosen. What she puts on next is where the evening genuinely begins to soften. A nightgown of fine white lawn cotton, soft from years of washing, and over it a quilted dressing gown the colour of dark plum, warm enough that it feels the moment her arms slide into it, almost like being wrapped in a small blanket. She unpins Margaret's hair next and begins brushing it in long, slow strokes, 100 of them, and Margaret's eyes drift half-closed as the elaborate arrangement she wore all day comes gently apart. A little jewellery comes off, a ring, a pair of small pearl earrings set carefully into a lined box for the night. Then the washing, warm water and rosewater soap worked gently over her face and hands, the scent lingering faintly in a way that will follow her towards sleep. Ellen leaves a single candle burning and slips quietly out, and Margaret, for the first time all day, is genuinely alone. She settles for a few minutes into the chair beside the fire, feet tucked beneath her, and opens the book waiting on the small table. This is, if she's honest with herself, her favourite part of the day, more than the piano, more than the letters, 20 or 30 minutes with no one watching her, and nothing at all expected of her. The fire pops softly. Her eyes grow heavy enough that the words start to blur, and she sets the book down, marking her place with a thin ribbon. Margaret rises, crosses the room, and pulls back the edge of the counterpane. The sheets still holding the last of the warmth from the pan Sarah ran across them nearly an hour ago now, meet her skin with a softness that never quite stops registering as a small pleasure, even after thousands of nights of exactly this same sensation. Linen washed this many times develops a particular texture, cool and smooth on first contact, and then warming almost immediately. Nothing like the crisp stiffness of new fabric, nothing at all like the slight clamminess of cheaper cloth. She slides fully beneath the top sheet and draws the wool blankets up, and then the counterpane over that, and the weight of it settles across her body in a way that feels, more than anything else, like being held. Her head finds the pillow, propped at its slight angle against the bolster. Beyond the heavy window curtains, the night outside continues doing whatever it is doing, wind moving through the bare branches at the edge of the garden, an owl somewhere past the wall, frost beginning to form on the grass in the dark. None of it reaches her. The fire has settled into low, steady coals that will glow softly for hours yet before finally dying down toward morning, and the room holds its warmth the way a held breath holds air. She reaches for the small brass snuffer beside the candle and presses the flame gently out, and the room goes dark except for the faint orange glow from the grate. I think about this moment often. The exact instant a person like Margaret closes her eyes for the night in a room like this one, because it represents something that took an enormous amount of quiet, coordinated, invisible labour to produce, and yet it feels, from the inside, like the simplest thing in the world. Warm, soft, quiet, safe. That is all comfort ever really is in the end, however much work it takes to build it. There is a Victorian belief, common enough in the household advice literature of this decade, that sufficient rest was directly connected to a woman's appearance and health, and it shaped how women like Margaret thought about their own sleep in ways quite different from how we think about it today. Ladies' magazines and household manuals frequently advised early and adequate hours of sleep as essential to what they called a fresh complexion, bright eyes, and a general appearance of health and vigour. Insufficient sleep, by contrast, was associated with a pale or sallow look, with shadows beneath the eyes, with a kind of visible fatigue a lady of good breeding was meant to avoid displaying. This was not medical science in the way we would understand it now, and Victorian explanations for exactly why rest mattered so much did not always match what modern medicine would later confirm. But the underlying advice was taken seriously and repeated consistently across decades of household literature. For Margaret, a full night of sleep was never purely indulgent. It was also understood in the language of her era as a kind of quiet maintenance, part of remaining what her world expected a lady to remain: rested, composed, ready to be looked at again the following day. How long she will actually sleep tonight depends a little on circumstance, but in a household like this one, where there is no need to rise before dawn to light fires or draw water, or begin the enormous machinery of morning work, a woman of Margaret's position might reasonably have 8 or even 9 hours set aside for rest, considerably more than most of the servants sleeping under this same roof will ever manage, more than her own grandmother managed in the smaller, colder house she grew up in before marrying into money. The luxury lay less in any guarantee of unbroken sleep, and more in simply having that many hours available to give to rest at all, without a single one of them owed to anyone else. Her breathing slows, the book stays closed on the small table by the dying fire, and somewhere below her, in the great dark house, everyone else's evening is only just beginning to wind down. The house does not go quiet all at once. It goes quiet in layers, the way a large building always does, room by room, floor by floor, each part of it settling into night at its own particular pace. Margaret's own fire was built generously enough at bedtime that it needs no further attention now, and it will simply burn low and steady through the rest of the night on its own, exactly as it was meant to, no one needing to return to this room again until morning. She has at last been left entirely undisturbed. Elsewhere in the house, the last few signs of the evening are quietly disappearing. Somewhere below a clock strikes the hour, its chime muffled by distance and by closed doors, and somewhere further off still, a lamp is carried down a darkened corridor, and finally extinguished, one small pool of light after another going out until only the faintest glow remains here and there behind a closed door. A door is tried, found locked, and left alone. Another creaks softly on its hinge somewhere far below, then falls silent again. The house settles the way a large old building always does at this hour, unevenly, one room at a time, small sounds rising and fading into a deepening quiet that will hold, more or less unbroken, until the earliest hours before dawn. Ventilation was its own peculiar obsession for the Victorians, and it shaped Margaret's bedroom in a way that might surprise you. Despite the effort spent warming the room, the household advice literature of the period was almost fanatical about the dangers of what they called foul air, the belief that a bedroom sealed too tightly overnight would grow stale and unhealthy from a sleeper's own breath. Doctors and domestic manuals alike recommended a window cracked open even in winter, if only by an inch, to let fresh air circulate while the sleeper stayed warm beneath heavy bedding. Margaret's window, behind its heavy curtain, is open just slightly tonight, enough to let a thin ribbon of cold October air slip into the room without meaningfully cooling it, a small compromise between two competing Victorian anxieties, the fear of stale air and the fear of cold. By the 1870s, most fashionable opinion had shifted toward leaving them open or removing them altogether, though older households and older sleepers who grew up trusting the curtains often kept the habit regardless of what the latest household manual recommended. Margaret splits the difference tonight without even thinking about it, curtains partly drawn, exactly as she does most nights. Down the corridor from her room, past 2 closed doors belonging to guest bedrooms currently empty and unused, hangs a small brass fitting beside her own door, unremarkable unless you know what it is. It is one end of the bell system that runs through the entire house, a network of wires and pulleys connecting every bedroom to a board of numbered bells down in the servants' hall, so that if Margaret needs anything at all in the night, a headache remedy, an extra blanket, simply someone's presence in the room, she need only reach for the pull beside her bed, and somewhere far below, a bell will swing and a number will be marked, and whoever is on night duty will climb however many stairs are necessary to answer it. She has used it perhaps a dozen times in the 11 years she has lived in this house, mostly for small things, and each time it has struck her, faintly, as an almost uncomfortable amount of power to hold over another person's sleep. A pull of a cord in a warm, dark bedroom, and somewhere else, someone rises from whatever rest they were managing to snatch and comes to answer a want that was not, most of the time, truly urgent at all. Sarah's own day is not finished yet, not by a long way, even though Margaret has already been asleep for the better part of an hour by the time the housemaid finally climbs the narrow back staircase toward her own bed. There is a particular architecture to a house like this one that most visitors never think about. A second, hidden building layered inside the first, connected by its own narrow staircases and its own plain corridors, designed so that the family's experience of the house and the servants' experience of the same house can run alongside each other, almost without touching. The main staircase, wide and carpeted, curves elegantly up through the centre of the building for the family and their guests to use. The back stairs, steep and uncarpeted, wind up through the walls themselves, barely wide enough for 2 people to pass, and this is the route Sarah takes every night, candle in hand, up past the 2nd floor where the family sleeps, up past the guest rooms, all the way to the very top of the house, under the roofline itself, where the ceiling slopes down at an angle and the small dormer windows look out over the dark lawn far below. Her room up here is shared with another housemaid, a girl named Alice, and it holds 2 narrow iron bedsteads, a single washstand between them, a small chest of drawers, and almost nothing else. No fire, most nights, unless coal has been specifically permitted for illness. The blankets are wool, serviceable rather than beautiful, and the mattress beneath them is a simple straw-filled tick rather than the layered luxury of Margaret's featherbed 3 floors below, firm in a way that has nothing to do with quality and everything to do with what straw does after enough months of use, which is compress and flatten and eventually need replacing entirely, usually later than it probably should. I do not say this to make the contrast feel like an accusation. Exactly, though it is impossible not to notice it. This is simply the honest shape of the house, the same roof sheltering 2 entirely different experiences of temperature and softness and rest, and both Sarah and Margaret, I suspect, would have found it strange if you tried to explain to either of them that it could have been arranged any other way. Sarah is asleep herself within perhaps 10 minutes of blowing out her own candle, which she lights only for the climb up the stairs, and extinguishes the moment she is safely in bed, because candles cost money and a housemaid's allowance for them is not generous. Her sleep tonight, and most nights, will be shorter than Margaret's by a significant margin, because Sarah's day begins again in the deep dark hours before dawn, well before any member of the family stirs, and there is a particular exhaustion that comes from that arrangement, one that settles into the body over years of service and never quite lifts, not even on a Sunday, not even on the rare half-day off. Elsewhere in the house, other rhythms are unfolding at their own pace. Down a different corridor from Margaret's room, past a heavy oak door, is the nursery, and here the household keeps its own particular version of nighttime order. A young child, perhaps 3 or 4 years old in our story tonight, has been asleep for hours already, tucked into a small bed with rails along the sides to keep her from rolling out, in a room kept slightly warmer than most of the house because children were widely believed, correctly as it happens, to need more consistent warmth than adults. A nursery maid sleeps in the same room, in a smaller bed positioned near the door, there specifically to wake at the first sound of a child's cry or cough or nightmare, her own rest permanently secondary to the small person she is responsible for. The nursery fire is kept burning through most of the night, tended more carefully than almost any other fire in the house apart from Margaret's own, because a chilled child was considered both a health risk and, frankly, a household emergency that no one wanted to explain to the mistress of the house in the morning. There is a fireguard in front of the grate, a simple metal mesh screen, standing between the flames and whatever small movements a sleeping or half-waking child might make in the night. Down the hall from the nursery are 2 guest bedrooms, both currently empty, though not neglected. Even unoccupied, they are kept aired and dusted weekly, their beds made up fresh, their fireplaces swept and ready to be laid at a moment's notice, because in a household like this one, guests can arrive with relatively little warning, and nothing would embarrass the housekeeper more than an unprepared bedroom. There is a particular kind of luxury in that too, I think, the luxury of maintaining beautiful, ready rooms that might sit empty for weeks at a time, simply so that hospitality, when it is needed, can appear effortless. Margaret has a son too, older than the small daughter asleep down the hall, currently away at a boarding school some hours distant by train, and his own bedroom sits at the far end of this same corridor, cared for exactly as carefully as every other room in the house, despite standing empty for most of the school term. Sarah dusts it weekly, airs the linen monthly, keeps a small fire ready to be laid on the rare occasions he returns for a holiday, and there is something quietly touching in that particular kind of maintenance, a room kept warm and ready in spirit if not in practice, waiting for a boy who will not actually sleep in it again until the Christmas holidays arrive. He sleeps tonight in a considerably plainer dormitory bed, one of perhaps 20 boys in a single long room, a single modest coal stove at one end doing what it can against the chill, thin blankets and a hard bolster replacing the layered luxury he takes for granted at home without ever quite noticing he is taking it for granted. This is, in its own way, a deliberate feature of English upper-class education in this era, rather than an oversight, a conviction among many families of this class that boys benefited from a certain amount of manufactured hardship, cold rooms and plain food and early rising, character-building exercises meant to counterbalance the very comfort a household like Margaret's otherwise provides so generously. Margaret herself has mixed feelings about this practice, feelings she has never fully voiced to her husband, who attended a similar school himself, and speaks of its discomforts with a kind of nostalgic fondness that Margaret privately finds difficult to entirely understand. I mention this because it complicates, just slightly, the neat picture we have built tonight of a family uniformly wrapped in comfort, and I think that complication is worth sitting with rather than smoothing over. Wealth in this era did not mean comfort applied evenly or automatically to every family member in every circumstance. It meant comfort was available, deployed deliberately according to a whole set of beliefs about what different people, at different ages, in different roles, actually needed or deserved. Beliefs that could produce a bedroom as carefully warmed as Margaret's own standing, right alongside a deliberate acceptance of cold dormitories and hard beds for a growing boy considered, in the thinking of the period, to need toughening rather than coddling. Margaret's husband, whom we have not yet mentioned tonight because tonight, as it happens, he is away, travelling on business that will keep him in London for most of the week, keeps his own bedroom just through a connecting door from hers, a common arrangement among wealthy Victorian couples of this class, less a sign of distance between them than simple practicality. Separate rooms meant separate dressing routines, separate hours when one or the other might read late or rise early, and a level of privacy that many couples of this era genuinely valued rather than resented. On nights when he is home, that connecting door often stands open, and on nights when he is not, as tonight, it remains closed, and his own room sits dark and cold and unused, its own fire unlit because there is no point wasting coal warming a bed that no one will sleep in. Her husband will return from London in 3 days, and the household is already, in its own quiet way, beginning to prepare for that return, though it will not become visibly busy for another day or 2 yet. His own bedroom, cold and unused tonight, will need its fire building again the evening before his arrival, his own sheets aired and warmed, his own washstand supplied. The connecting door between his room and Margaret's, swept and dusted, and left standing open in anticipation, a small physical signal, understood by everyone in the household without ever needing to be spoken aloud, that the family's full rhythm is about to resume after several days of this quieter, smaller version of itself. There is something worth noticing in how differently a house breathes depending on who is currently sleeping within its walls. Tonight, with the master of the house absent, the whole rhythm has shifted almost imperceptibly, one fewer fire to build, one fewer washstand to supply, a certain easing of the evening's total workload that Sarah and Ellen and the rest of the staff feel, even if none of them would ever think to comment on it directly. His return in 3 days will tighten that rhythm back to its fuller shape, and Margaret, for her part, looks forward to it in the particular quiet way a woman looks forward to a spouse's return after a short absence. Genuine warmth mixed with a faint private awareness that she has also, in some small unacknowledged way, enjoyed these few nights of a slightly smaller, slightly quieter household organized entirely around her own rhythms, rather than needing to accommodate two. None of this touches her tonight beyond a passing thought as she drifted towards sleep, the bed feeling, if anything, a touch more spacious than usual, without another person's eventual presence to consider, though this is not something she would ever admit finding pleasant, not even to herself in any fully articulated way. It simply sits there, one small honest thread among the many we have followed tonight, part of the real, complicated, entirely ordinary texture of a marriage, carried out partly in shared rooms and partly in separate ones, comfort and connection and occasional private relief, all woven together in ways that resist any simple, tidy summary. The house is locked for the night by this hour, though locked means something slightly different here than it might mean to you. The heavy front door was bolted and chained sometime around 10 by the butler, who checks it personally each night as one of his final duties before retiring himself, along with the French doors leading out to the terrace and the smaller side entrance near the kitchen garden that the tradesmen use during the day. Windows on the ground floor are latched. It is not a fortress exactly, this house, out here in quiet countryside where genuine danger from outside is rare, but there is a ritual to the checking regardless, a final circuit through the darkened downstairs rooms with a lamp held high, doors tried one by one, before the last person awake finally climbs the stairs themselves. There is a long case clock in the main hall, its pendulum swinging steadily behind glass, and its chime carries up through the house at each hour, muffled by distance and by closed doors but never entirely silent. Margaret, deep in sleep now, does not hear it strike 10 or 11. Sarah, 3 floors up, does not hear it either, exhausted past the point where a distant chime could reach her, but somewhere in the house someone almost always does, a housemaid still finishing the last of the evening's work in the kitchen, the butler making his final rounds, and for that person the clock is less a sound than a kind of gentle pressure, a reminder of how much night remains and how early the next day will begin. Sound moves strangely through a house like this one after dark, when the ordinary daytime noise of footsteps and conversation and doors opening and closing has mostly stopped, a floorboard settling somewhere overhead as the temperature drops, wind finding a gap somewhere in an old window frame and producing a thin, almost musical whistle that comes and goes depending on how hard the gusts outside are blowing, the occasional soft collapse of coals shifting in a grate as a fire burns down toward embers. These sounds, ordinary and explainable in daylight, take on a slightly different weight in the deep quiet of a sleeping house, and more than one Victorian ghost story, it is worth mentioning, drew its inspiration from exactly this, the strange acoustic life of a large old building settling into the night. Outside, the weather has shifted since Margaret first climbed into bed. What began as a clear, cold evening has brought in a thin mist that now clings low over the lawn and the kitchen garden, beading on the leaves of the box hedges, softening the outline of the stable block visible from the upper windows. By midnight a light rain has begun, tapping gently against the glass of Margaret's window, audible even through the heavy curtain if you happen to be awake and listening for it, though Margaret, warm and deeply asleep beneath her layers of linen and wool and quilted silk, hears none of it at all. Not every night in this house passes so smoothly, of course. and it would be dishonest to pretend that sleep always came this easily to everyone under this roof, Margaret included. On nights when sleep proved difficult, and every household in this era had them, the remedies available to a woman of her position were modest by comparison to today, but not non-existent. A cup of warm milk, sometimes with a little honey, brought up quietly by whoever was on late duty, a few drops of lavender water on the pillow, a scent widely believed by the domestic literature of the period to encourage calm. In more persistent cases, a household might keep a small supply of chloral hydrate or laudanum on hand, prescribed by the family physician for genuine sleeplessness, though most respectable households used these sparingly and with real caution, aware even then that such remedies carried risks alongside their relief. For Margaret, most nights, none of this proves necessary. Tonight it certainly does not. Illness changed everything about how a Victorian household slept, and it is worth spending a moment on this, because it reveals how much of the elaborate comfort we have described tonight was really a kind of insurance against exactly this possibility. If Margaret were to wake tonight with a fever, or a child in the nursery cried out with the particular ragged cough that every mother of this era learned to fear, the entire quiet machinery of the house would shift almost instantly into a different gear. The bell pull beside her bed would summon someone within minutes. A fire already lit and already warm means no delay in keeping a sick person comfortable while help is gathered. Hot water is already close at hand rather than needing to be heated from cold. If the family doctor needed to be sent for, a groom would be roused from the stable block, a horse saddled in the dark, and a rider dispatched down the country lanes toward the nearest town, a journey that could take the better part of an hour each way depending on the weather and the hour, and how well the horse knew the road in darkness. This is, I think, part of why so much careful attention was paid to warmth and preparedness in a bedroom like Margaret's, beyond simple comfort for its own sake. 19th century medicine understood shockingly little about the actual causes of most illness, but it understood correctly that a warm, well-rested, well-nourished body tended to weather sickness better than an exhausted, chilled one. Keeping a bedroom warm through the night was not purely indulgent. It was, in the thinking of the era, a genuine form of preventive care. Tonight, thankfully, no one in this house is ill. The child in the nursery sleeps soundly, one small hand curled against her cheek in the way children do, and the nursery maid dozes lightly in her own bed nearby, alert in that particular half-awake way that mothers and caretakers develop, ready to surface fully at the first unfamiliar sound, but otherwise resting as deeply as the arrangement allows. Down in the kitchen, several floors below Margaret's warm bedroom, a very different rhythm is winding to its close. The cook retired hours ago, her own work finished well before dark, but a scullery maid, the youngest and most junior member of the entire household staff, is only now finishing the last of the evening's washing up, scouring pots by the light of a single candle, her hands raw from repeated immersion in water that has long since gone lukewarm. This is, without question, the hardest and least glamorous position in the entire house, and the girl performing it tonight is perhaps 15 years old, new to service, still learning the particular geography of where everything belongs. The kitchen fire itself is banked rather than extinguished, coals raked together and covered with a layer of ash that will keep them smouldering slowly through the night without burning away entirely, ready to be coaxed back into a full blaze in the very early morning with far less effort than starting completely from cold. This banking of the kitchen fire is one of the quiet, essential skills of household management, and getting it wrong, letting the fire die out completely overnight, means an entire household running late the following morning, breakfast delayed, hot water unavailable, a domino effect of lateness that no housekeeper wants to explain. Monday, 2 days from now in our story, will bring the great weekly wash, and it is worth mentioning here, if only briefly, because it connects so directly to everything Margaret experienced tonight without ever thinking about it. The fine linen sheets on her bed, the soft worn nightgown, the pillowcases edged in lace, none of it stays clean and soft by accident. Wash day in a house like this one is an entire operation unto itself, beginning before dawn and often not finishing until well into the evening, involving enormous coppers of boiling water, harsh soap, wooden dolly sticks for agitating heavy fabric, mangles for wringing it dry, and hours spent hanging linen to air, first outdoors when weather permits, and then before the kitchen fire when it does not. Sheets are rotated through this cycle constantly, washed, dried, aired, ironed with heavy flat irons heated on the stove, and finally folded and stored in the linen press with sprigs of dried lavender tucked between the layers to keep them smelling fresh. Every soft, sweet-smelling sheet Margaret has ever slept on represents this entire invisible cycle, repeated week after week, year after year, by hands she rarely thinks about at all. Tonight's arrangements would look quite different if we had opened this story in July instead of October, and I think it is worth pausing here to sketch that other version of the evening for a moment, because the contrast tells you something true about how thoroughly the seasons shaped Victorian domestic life. In high summer, Margaret's fire would not be lit at all most nights, the room warm enough on its own that the grate sits empty and swept, decorative rather than functional, until autumn returns. The heavy wool blankets and the quilted silk counterpane would be packed away in the linen press, replaced with a single lighter cover, sometimes nothing more than a sheet, because the same weight that feels so comforting in October would feel stifling in the thick heat of late July. The window, rather than being cracked open by an inch, might stand open nearly its full width, curtains drawn back to let whatever breeze exists move freely through the room. Mosquito netting sometimes hung around the bed in years when the insects proved troublesome, particularly near low-lying land or standing water. The warming pan disappears entirely from summer use, obviously, its purpose meaningless when the sheets are already too warm rather than too cold. In its place, some households of this era kept a different tool altogether, a simple stoneware bottle that could be filled with cold water instead and placed near the sleeper's feet on the very hottest nights, a small and somewhat ineffective attempt at the opposite problem. Ellen's evening routine changes too, in ways large and small. The elaborate nightly hairbrushing continues regardless of season, but the heavy quilted dressing gown Margaret wears tonight would be replaced in July with something far lighter, a simple cotton wrapper, barely more than the nightgown itself, and the whole rhythm of the evening tends to run later in summer, the long daylight hours of an English June or July stretching well past 9 in the evening, pulling bedtime itself gradually later along with the setting sun, until by August the household has drifted toward retiring closer to 10 than 9, without anyone quite deciding to make the change on purpose. What stays constant across every season, interestingly, is the underlying logic of the whole system, comfort built and maintained through careful, coordinated, mostly invisible labour, adjusted continuously to match whatever the weather outside happens to be doing. A house like this one does not simply endure the seasons, it answers them, room by room, night by night, with an attentiveness that required real skill and real knowledge, passed down from housekeeper to housemaid across generations of service, most of it never written down anywhere at all, simply carried in the hands and habits of the people who did the work. It is well past midnight now in our story, and the deepest, stillest part of the night has settled fully over the house. This is the hour when almost everyone under this roof, family and servants alike, is genuinely asleep, the one stretch of the 24-hour cycle when the strict social distance between Margaret's world and Sarah's world dissolves, at least in this one narrow sense, because sleep does not care about status. Margaret dreams, whatever she dreams, 3 floors below the small shared room where Sarah and Alice dream their own dreams beneath their plainer, thinner blankets. The child in the nursery has turned over once, murmured something unintelligible, and settled again without fully waking, and the nursery maid, half alert even in her own sleep, has not needed to rise. The fire in Margaret's room has burned down to a bed of quiet orange coals, giving off just enough warmth to keep the chill at bay without the leaping flame of earlier in the evening. Outside, the light rain that began around midnight has settled into a steady, gentle patter against the windows, the kind of sound that if you are awake to hear it might feel almost deliberately soothing, though of course no one designed it that way. It is simply October doing what October does in the English countryside, in the deep quiet hours when almost nothing moves except weather and the occasional shifting settle of an old house cooling slightly further into the night. Margaret's room, lit only by the dying fire now, looks entirely different than it did an hour ago in full lamplight. and there is something worth noticing in that shift. The way the same space can hold such different characters depending on the hour. The wallpaper, a deep botanical print of ferns and trailing ivy chosen 4 years ago when the room was last redecorated, has gone almost entirely to shadow, only the faintest suggestion of its pattern still visible where the last of the firelight reaches the nearest wall. The dressing table across the room, with its oval mirror and its small collection of silver-backed brushes and the china box holding tonight's pearl earrings, sits mostly in darkness now, a vague pale shape rather than the carefully arranged surface it was earlier. Even the counterpane, that deep wine-coloured silk that caught the light so beautifully at 9 o'clock, has lost its colour almost entirely in the dark, reduced to a slightly darker patch against the general dimness of the bed. This is, I think, one of the underappreciated aspects of Victorian domestic life. How much of a room's daytime identity, its careful decoration, its display of taste and means, simply disappears once the candles are out, leaving behind only the parts that matter for actual sleep: warmth, softness, darkness, quiet. Everything else was, in a real sense, performance, meant to be seen and admired by daylight or lamplight, largely irrelevant to the body once it finally surrenders to rest. Margaret shifts once in her sleep, turning from her side onto her back, one hand coming to rest against the pillow near her face, and settles again almost immediately without any real disturbance to her breathing. This is normal, ordinary movement, the kind every sleeping body makes several times through a full night, and it barely registers even to her, let alone to anyone else, since there is no one else in the room to notice it at all. Outside, past the stable block visible from her window during the day but invisible now in the dark and the rain, a different kind of night is unfolding entirely. The horses stand quietly in their stalls, 3 of them belonging to the family, and 2 more kept for the estate's working needs, and the stable boy responsible for them sleeps in a small loft room above the tack room, close enough to hear if anything genuinely alarming happened below, a fire, an escaped animal, though nothing of the sort troubles this particular night. A dog, kept mostly for the gamekeeper's use rather than as a household pet in the modern sense, lies curled near the kitchen door, occasionally lifting its head at some sound too faint or too distant for a human to register, then settling back down. The gamekeeper himself, whose cottage sits at the far edge of the estate, near the woods where the family's pheasant shoots take place each autumn, is awake for a portion of this night, as he often is, making a slow circuit of the nearer coverts with a lantern, watching for poachers who occasionally try their luck under cover of darkness and bad weather, exactly like tonight's. This is its own small drama playing out at the edges of the estate, while the house itself sleeps soundly, unconnected to anything happening in Margaret's warm bedroom, and yet part of the same larger system that keeps this entire world running, the same hierarchy of labour and privilege extending outward from the house itself into the fields and woods that surround it. Not far from those same woods, the gamekeeper's wife is not asleep at exactly this hour either, sitting up in her small cottage for reasons entirely different from anything happening inside the main house. Her youngest child, not yet 2 years old, has been fussy with the beginnings of a cold for the past 2 days, and she sits now beside a small fire of her own, considerably more modest than any burning in Margaret's bedroom, rocking the child gently and humming something low and wordless, the particular exhausted patience of a mother managing illness without any of the resources available 3/4 of a mile away in the main house. She would never think to send for Dr. Pemberton over something this ordinary, a common cold working its way through a small child exactly as it works through children everywhere, in every era, regardless of their family's wealth or position. She manages it herself as her own mother managed such things before her. A little honey in warm water, a flannel cloth wrung out and pressed gently to a warm forehead, the old inherited knowledge of women who have always had to manage illness largely on their own resources rather than calling on trained medical help for every small complaint. There is no judgment intended in placing this scene alongside Margaret's own elaborately comfortable night, only the simple observation that illness and discomfort do not pause themselves out of deference to social hierarchy, that a mile of distance and a considerable gulf of wealth separate 2 women managing entirely different versions of an ordinary October night. One wrapped in feather bedding and silk, drifting toward 9 hours of uninterrupted sleep and one awake at nearly 2 in the morning with a fretful child, working with nothing more than a small fire and her own tired hands and whatever quiet resolve keeps any mother going through exactly this kind of long, unglamorous night. By morning, the child's fever, mild as it likely is, will probably have broken on its own, the way most such small illnesses do, and the gamekeeper's wife will manage her own day on considerably less sleep than she needed, exactly as she has managed countless similar nights before this one, and will manage countless more after it. This particular version of resilience receiving no special recognition from anyone, least of all from the comfortable house standing quiet and dark not far from her own cottage window, entirely unaware, on this particular night, of the small private struggle unfolding so close by. In London, a good 4 hours away by the fastest train available in this decade, Margaret's husband sleeps in a rented set of rooms kept for exactly this purpose, comfortable enough by any reasonable standard but noticeably plainer than his own bedroom at home, no lady's maid or valet immediately at hand tonight, his own man having stayed behind to attend to estate matters rather than accompany him on what was meant to be a brief trip. There is something almost funny about this, if you think about it the right way, the fact that even a wealthy man travelling on business finds himself, for a few nights, living closer to how most people actually lived than to how his own household normally arranges things around him. He misses his own bed, if he thinks about it at all before sleep finds him, though probably not as much as the household back home, quietly and efficiently continuing its rhythms without him, might imagine he does. Sometime around 2 in the morning, the small girl in the nursery wakes with a start, though not from any real distress, more the ordinary disorientation of a young child surfacing briefly from a deep dream she will not remember by morning. The nursery maid is awake within seconds, before the child has even fully understood she has woken, and crosses the short distance between the two beds with the kind of quiet, practiced movement that comes from months of exactly this same routine, a few soft words, barely more than a murmur, a hand resting gently against the child's back, the offer of a small stuffed rabbit, worn soft from constant handling, tucked back into the crook of an arm. Within a minute or two, the child's breathing has evened out again, and within 5, she is fully asleep once more, the entire small drama already fading from both their memories, leaving no trace behind except a slightly rumpled blanket that the nursery maid straightens before returning to her own bed. This happens most nights in some form, a brief surfacing, a small comfort offered, a return to sleep, and it is easy to overlook how much quiet skill this actually requires, how thoroughly a good nursery maid comes to know the particular rhythms and needs of the one small person she is responsible for, often better, in some ways, than the child's own mother knows them, simply because she is the one present for every single one of these small nighttime moments across months and years of service. The rain outside has eased somewhat by this hour, settling into an intermittent drizzle, rather than the steadier patter of midnight, though the wind has picked up a little in compensation, moving through the bare branches of the old oak trees that line the drive with a low, continuous sound that carries faintly through the walls of the house, without being loud enough to properly wake anyone. There is a particular quality to a large house at this specific hour, somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning, that even the people who live in such houses rarely experience consciously, because by definition they are usually asleep for it. It is the hour when the fires have burned lowest, when the temperature throughout the building has dropped to its coldest point of the entire cycle, when even the small ambient sounds of daytime life, footsteps, voices, doors, have entirely ceased, leaving only weather and the occasional structural settling of old timber and older stone. Margaret's own fire has reduced to little more than a faint red glow among grey ash by now, no longer producing meaningful heat, though the room itself retains enough residual warmth, trapped by heavy curtains and thick walls, and the general insulating mass of Victorian construction, that she remains perfectly comfortable beneath her layers of linen and wool and silk. This is, in fact, part of the genuine engineering behind a room like this one, the understanding that a fire does not need to burn all night at full strength if the room itself has been built and dressed well enough to hold on to whatever warmth was generated earlier in the evening. The heavy curtains, the thick carpet, the substantial walls, the bed hangings, All of it works together as a kind of passive thermal system. Centuries of accumulated practical wisdom about how to keep a body warm through a long, cold night without needing constant active intervention. If you had asked Margaret at any point in her life to explain why her bedroom felt the way it felt, she likely could not have given you this kind of technical answer. She would simply have told you it felt cozy, felt safe, felt like exactly the place she wanted to be at the end of a long day, without any particular curiosity about the accumulated centuries of trial and error, the countless small adjustments made by countless households before hers that had produced this exact combination of fabric and fire and architecture and habit. That is, I think, the nature of comfort when it is done well. It disappears into itself. It stops looking like a system and starts simply feeling like home. There are objects scattered through Margaret's room that hold small private histories she rarely thinks about consciously, even though her hand brushes past most of them every single night without fail. The silver-backed hairbrush Ellen used earlier this evening was a wedding gift from her own mother, engraved along the handle with her initials in a script so delicate it has nearly worn away after 12 years of daily use. The china box holding her pearl earrings once belonged to her husband's grandmother, passed down through 2 generations before Margaret's own hands took over its small daily duty of keeping a few pieces of jewellery safe overnight. Even the ribbon marking her place in tonight's book, faded now to a pale, uncertain blue, was originally part of a much larger length of trim purchased for a dress she wore to her own wedding, most of it long since used up or discarded, this small remaining scrap repurposed for exactly this quiet daily function. None of this is remarkable, exactly. Every bedroom accumulates this kind of small private archaeology over years of habitation, objects that carry meaning invisible to anyone but the person who placed them there. But there is something worth noticing in how much of Margaret's comfort tonight and every night is built not just from warmth and softness, but from familiarity, from the accumulated weight of thousands of previous nights spent in this exact room, surrounded by these exact objects, following this exact sequence of small rituals. A stranger given this same room, this same bed, these same fine linens, would likely sleep comfortably enough, but they would not sleep quite the way Margaret sleeps, because comfort, real comfort, the deepest kind, is built partly from repetition and familiarity as much as from the physical quality of the materials themselves. Somewhere close to 2 in the morning, a light rain begins tapping against the windows again, gentler than the earlier shower that passed through around midnight, more a fine mist condensing against the cold glass than any real downpour, and it lends the whole house a particular hush that settles even more deeply over the already quiet corridors and staircases. I find myself thinking, in this stretch of the deepest night, about the sheer number of small decisions that had to align correctly over years and years of accumulated household practice to produce the specific version of comfort Margaret experiences without ever once having to think about it. Someone decided, a generation or more ago, exactly how thick the curtains in this particular bedroom should be to properly block both light and cold. Someone decided the precise ratio of horsehair to wool to feather that makes this particular mattress feel exactly as it feels. Someone decided that warming pans should be used every night rather than only the coldest ones, that fires should be rebuilt before dawn rather than left to die completely, that a lady's maid's morning duties should include laying out warmed undergarments rather than simply presenting the day's clothing cold from the wardrobe. None of these decisions were made all at once, and none of them were made by any single person sitting down to design an ideal system of comfort from first principles. They accumulated instead, across decades of trial and adjustment, one housekeeper's small improvement building on a previous housekeeper's earlier innovation, one generation's household manual absorbing and refining the practical wisdom of the generation before it, until the whole elaborate system simply existed, fully formed, ready to be stepped into by anyone lucky enough to be born, as Margaret was, into a household wealthy enough to maintain it. This is, I think, one of the quieter truths worth sitting with tonight. The way comfort of this depth and this consistency is never really invented fresh by any single person, but inherited, refined, and passed carefully forward, generation after generation, family after family, each one contributing some small adjustment to a system considerably larger and older than any individual involved in maintaining it on any given ordinary October night. It is nearly 4 in the morning now, and the darkest, coldest stretch of the entire night has finally begun, almost imperceptibly, to loosen its grip. There is no dramatic moment to mark this shift, no single instant when night becomes morning. It happens the way these things always happen, gradually, unevenly, the sky beyond the heavy curtains, still fully black but beginning, if you could see it, to carry the very faintest suggestion of a different quality of darkness, not lighter exactly, not yet, but somehow less absolute than it was 2 hours earlier. The rain has stopped entirely now, leaving behind a still, damp, quiet world outside, mist rising faintly from the wet grass of the lawn, the stable block and the kitchen garden wall barely visible as darker shapes against the general blackness. Inside the house, this is the hour when the first stirring of the new day genuinely begins, though not from Margaret, still deeply asleep 3 floors up, and not from the family generally. It begins, as it begins every single morning in a household like this one, with the servants, and specifically with whoever holds the responsibility for being first awake, a position that in this house falls to the head housemaid, an older woman named Martha, who has held this particular duty for 6 years now, and has never in all that time needed anyone to wake her. Martha simply wakes at 4:30 most mornings without any mechanical assistance, her body having learnt this schedule so thoroughly across years of repetition that it now operates almost independently of conscious effort. She dresses quickly in the cold darkness of her own small room, splashes her face with water left in her basin from the night before, now uncomfortably cold, and lights a single candle before making her way down the same narrow back staircase Sarah climbed hours earlier, moving carefully in the dark toward the one task that must happen before almost anything else can begin. The kitchen, when Martha reaches it, is exactly as it was left the night before, the banked fire still holding its slow ember glow beneath its blanket of ash, and her first task is to rake that ash carefully aside, feed in fresh kindling, and coax the whole thing back into proper flame, a process that takes perhaps 10 minutes of patient, practiced effort before the fire is burning strongly enough to begin heating the enormous kettles that will supply hot water to the entire house for the next several hours. This single fire, rebuilt in the dark by one woman working largely alone, is genuinely the engine that drives the entire household's morning. Without it, there is no hot water for washing, no means of preparing breakfast, no way to warm the family's bedrooms before they wake. Martha understands this responsibility with the kind of quiet seriousness that comes from having done the same job for years, and there is a real satisfaction in watching the flames finally catch properly, orange light spreading across the stone floor of the kitchen in the otherwise pitch-dark house, the first true sign of a new day beginning anywhere within these walls. One by one, the rest of the household staff begin to stir in the wake of Martha's example, though not all at once, and not all with equal urgency. The scullery maid rises next, needing to be at her post early to begin the unglamorous work of the day. Black leading the kitchen range, scrubbing the stone floor, filling the coal scuttles that will be needed throughout the house. Sarah wakes not long after, her own body trained to this rhythm just as thoroughly as Martha's, dressing quickly in the cold of her shared attic room, while Alice, in the bed beside her, does the same, both of them moving through the familiar motions with the particular efficiency of people who understand exactly how little time there is before the family begins to wake, and expect the household to already feel effortlessly, invisibly ready. Sarah's first task of the morning takes her back to the very same bedroom where she spent so much time the evening before, though the purpose now is different. Margaret's fire, which burned down to nothing but cold grey ash sometime in the deepest hours of the night, needs rebuilding before its occupant wakes, so that when Margaret eventually opens her eyes, the room will already be warming rather than cold. Sarah moves as quietly as she moved the night before, kneeling at the same grate, clearing the dead ash into her pail, laying fresh kindling and coal with the same practiced hands, striking a match in the grey pre-dawn light that has begun, just barely, to seep around the edges of the heavy curtains. Margaret does not wake for this. She remains deeply, peacefully asleep, turned now onto her side with one hand tucked beneath her pillow, entirely unaware that her bedroom is once again being quietly prepared around her, this time for the day ahead rather than the night behind her. Sarah works efficiently and leaves within a few minutes, careful not to disturb the sleeping woman, though she does pause, just briefly, the same small habit she indulged the night before, to look at the sleeping figure in the bed and feel, for a moment, something that is not quite envy and not quite anything else she could easily name. A recognition, maybe, of the enormous distance between the life she is building this fire for and the life she herself is living, both of them young women in the same house on the same cold October morning, separated by a distance that neither of them chose, and neither of them, most days, thinks about very consciously at all. Down in the kitchen, the morning's real work has begun in earnest by the time the sky outside has shifted from black to a deep, uncertain grey. The cook has risen now too, taking over from where Martha's fire preparation left off, and the particular smells of an English country house breakfast beginning to take shape have started to fill the lower floors of the house. Bread already proofed the night before, now going into the oven, bacon beginning to render its fat in a heavy pan, the specific mineral smell of a kettle just beginning to sing on the newly built fire. Trays are being assembled for those family members who take breakfast in their rooms rather than downstairs, a common enough practice among wealthy women of this era, particularly on quieter mornings without guests to entertain. A small pot of tea, a single cup and saucer, perhaps a slice of thin bread and butter, arranged with the same careful attention that characterized every part of Margaret's evening the night before, because this household does not distinguish in its standard of care between preparing for sleep and preparing to wake. Both matter equally. Both receive the same invisible, coordinated labor from people whose own mornings look nothing like the one being prepared for someone else. The sky beyond the kitchen windows has lightened further now, the deep grey of true pre-dawn giving way to something paler, tinged faintly at the eastern edge with the barest suggestion of colour, not yet sunrise but clearly, unmistakably its approach. Frost has settled thick and white across the lawn overnight, visible now in the growing light, sparkling faintly where it catches what little brightness the sky currently offers. Somewhere beyond the kitchen garden, a bird begins to call, tentative at first and then joined by others, the ordinary morning chorus of an English countryside, slowly waking around a house whose human occupants, for the most part, remain still asleep inside it. I want to sit with something for a moment before we return to Margaret and the last hour of her sleep, because it occurs to me that everything we have watched happen tonight, the fire building, the bed warming, the careful layering of linen and wool and silk, represents only the most ordinary version of how this household manages its nights. There are other nights, rarer ones, when the whole system stretches and strains in ways worth understanding, and I think they tell you even more about what comfort actually cost in a house like this one. Consider what happens when this house fills with guests, as it does perhaps 6 or 8 times a year, most dramatically during the shooting season in autumn, when a dozen or more visitors might arrive for a long weekend of sport and society. Every one of those empty, quietly maintained guest bedrooms we mentioned earlier suddenly springs into use all at once, and the household's entire nighttime rhythm transforms overnight, quite literally. Fires must be laid and lit in 6 or 7 additional rooms rather than one. Warming pans multiply. Hot water must be carried up not to a single washstand, but to a dozen of them, each guest expecting the same seamless, invisible comfort Margaret takes for granted every single night of her own life. The strain of this falls almost entirely on the staff, and it falls hardest during exactly the hours we have spent tonight watching them work. Sarah and the other housemaids might find themselves managing double or triple their ordinary evening workload, moving from room to room with barely a pause between them, while still needing to rise at the same early hour the following morning to begin it all again. House party weekends were, by every honest account from the period, exhausting for domestic staff in a way that rarely showed itself to the guests enjoying the results, who experienced only the same effortless warmth and readiness Margaret experiences on an ordinary Tuesday, with no sense at all of how many additional hands and additional hours it took to produce that same effortlessness at scale. There is a particular kind of night, too, that this household has experienced only rarely, but which shapes how everyone in it thinks about sleep and comfort when it does occur, and that is the night surrounding a birth. When Margaret's own daughter, the small girl now sleeping soundly in the nursery, was born 4 years ago, this same bedroom became, for a period of some weeks, an entirely different kind of space, a lying-in chamber kept deliberately warmer than usual, its fire tended around the clock rather than banked overnight, extra bedding brought in, a monthly nurse installed in a small bed nearby for the duration, much as the nursery maid sleeps near the child now. Comfort in those weeks was not simply pleasant. It was understood as medically necessary, part of the careful management of a mother's recovery, and the household mobilized around it with an intensity that ordinary nights never require. Illness in an elderly relative produces something similar, a temporary reshaping of the whole house's nighttime attention around a single vulnerable sleeper. Extra fires, more frequent checking, warming pans deployed more than once through a night rather than only at bedtime, and morning, when it comes, changes the texture of sleep in this house in its own particular way, the household's grief expressed partly through small material adjustments, black-bordered stationery, the family in mourning dress, but also through a kind of hushed, careful attentiveness to whoever is grieving most acutely, extra warmth offered almost instinctively as a form of comfort when words feel inadequate, which they so often do. None of this touches Margaret tonight. Tonight is simply ordinary, which is, I think, its own kind of quiet luxury. The privilege of an unremarkable night in a house built and staffed and maintained specifically to make unremarkable nights feel this comfortable, this effortless, this entirely free of the small emergencies and exceptional demands that occasionally reshape everything around them. There is one more variation worth mentioning, gently, because it touches this same bedroom in a way that shaped Margaret's earliest understanding of what marriage and comfort and privacy might mean together. And that is her own wedding night, 12 years ago now, spent in this very room during the first weeks of her marriage, before she and her husband settled into the separate but connected bedrooms they keep today. Victorian wedding night customs, at least among families of this class, tended toward a particular kind of careful, almost ceremonial privacy, the household staff making every effort to ensure the newly married couple's first nights together felt undisturbed and unobserved, fires built especially generously, the finest linen the household owned brought out for the occasion, and an unspoken understanding among the staff that this particular room, on this particular set of nights, was to be approached with even more than the usual discretion. Margaret remembers very little of the practical details now, the way memory tends to blur the specific in favor of the emotional, but she remembers the warmth of the room, and she remembers feeling, for the first time in her adult life, that a bedroom could hold an entirely different kind of significance than simple rest. At the other end of life entirely, in households like this one, elderly relatives sleeping under the family roof often required a different calibration of comfort altogether, more warmth rather than less, softer bedding rather than firm, earlier bedtimes and later risings where circumstance allowed, and a general household understanding that an older body needed more careful protection against cold and draught than a younger one. Margaret's own grandmother, in the years before her death, occupied a bedroom on this same floor, kept notably warmer than most, her fire built up generously each evening and checked more than once through the night, her bed dressed with an extra blanket regardless of season, small accommodations that the household made without much discussion because they simply understood, the way households of this era generally did, that comfort needed to be adjusted to the particular body it was meant to serve. I mention all of this not to wander too far from Margaret's own night tonight, but because I think it deepens the picture rather than distracting from it. This bedroom, this exact room where she sleeps so peacefully right now, in the pale grey light of early morning, has held all of these different versions of comfort across the years, wedding night warmth, the careful attention of illness, the particular hush of grief, the steady accommodation of old age, and tonight, simply, wonderfully, none of that. Tonight it is only an ordinary bed, holding an ordinary sleeping woman, on an ordinary October night, and there is something worth appreciating in that ordinariness too, the fact that comfort does not always need a special occasion to justify itself. It is worth pausing here, in this quiet stretch of the night while Margaret sleeps on undisturbed, to properly introduce the woman who makes an entire evening like this one possible, because so far she has existed only as a kind of background presence, felt rather than seen, and she deserves better than that. Mrs. Fenwick, the housekeeper, does not appear in any of the scenes we have watched unfold tonight, not directly, and this is itself telling, because her actual role in this household is to ensure that everyone else's role happens correctly without her needing to be physically present for most of it. She has held this position for nearly 20 years, risen to it after beginning her own service as a housemaid not so different from Sarah, decades ago in a different house entirely, and the authority she carries now, second only to the butler in the household's internal hierarchy, and answerable directly to the family itself, was built one small competent decision at a time across 2 full decades of service. It was Mrs. Fenwick who decided, years ago, exactly how many minutes before Margaret's usual retiring hour the bedroom fire should be lit, calculating backward from years of observation to determine the precise timing that keeps the room comfortably warm without wasting coal on an empty room lit too early. It was Mrs. Fenwick who trained Sarah in the particular sequence of tasks we watched unfold at the very start of tonight's story: the order of fire before bed, bed before water, water before final inspection, a sequence that looks effortless now only because it was drilled into muscle memory across months of careful supervision. It is Mrs. Fenwick's household ledger, kept in a locked drawer in her own small sitting room just off the kitchen corridor, that tracks exactly how much coal, how much candle wax, how much lamp oil, how many yards of linen this household consumes each month, and it is her careful management of those resources that allows a family like Margaret's to enjoy the appearance of effortless abundance while actually operating within quite deliberate limits. She does not sleep particularly well herself, if the truth were told, though this is not something she would ever share with anyone in the family, nor with most of the staff beneath her. 2 decades of responsibility for other people's comfort has left her with a habit of waking at the smallest unfamiliar sound, some old instinct developed across years of nights spent listening, half-consciously, for exactly the kind of trouble that would require her attention. Tonight there is no trouble, and Mrs. Fenwick sleeps as well as she ever does, in her own small but comfortably appointed room near the kitchen, a position of relative privilege among the staff that reflects her seniority, a proper bed rather than the narrow attic beds Sarah and Alice share, a small fire of her own permitted most nights of the colder months. Sarah's own path into this household is worth a moment too, because it explains something about why a 19-year-old girl performs the elaborate evening ritual we watched with such careful practiced skill, rather than fumbling awkwardly through it. She arrived here 4 years ago, at 15, the daughter of a tenant farmer on a different, smaller estate some miles distant, one of 6 children in a household that could use the extra income her position provides far more than it could use another pair of hands at home. Her first months in service were spent almost entirely under Martha's direct supervision, learning not just the practical mechanics of fire building and bed making, but the entire invisible etiquette of household service, how to move through a room without drawing attention to her own presence, how to time her work around the family's movements so their paths crossed as rarely as possible, how to anticipate a need before it was voiced rather than waiting to be asked. It was difficult at first, she would tell you honestly if you asked her, though she rarely thinks to frame it that way anymore. 4 years having smoothed the sharpest edges of that early homesickness into something closer to simple acceptance. She sends most of her modest wages home each quarter, keeping only a small amount for herself, and she has, in 4 years, risen already from the lowest tier of housemaid duties towards something closer to a proper position of her own, trusted now with tasks, like the bedroom preparation we watched tonight, that would not have been given to her in her very first year. Ellen's story runs differently, shaped by a different set of circumstances entirely. She came to ladies' maid work somewhat later than most, in her mid-20s rather than her teens, after several years spent in a dressmaker's workshop in a nearby town where she developed the specific sewing and hairdressing skills that eventually recommended her for this more prestigious position. There is a particular skill required of a good lady's maid that goes well beyond the practical mechanics of dressing and undressing, buttoning and unbuttoning, brushing and pinning, and that is the skill of being present, intimately present, in someone else's most private moments, day after day, year after year, without ever presuming a familiarity the social distance between them does not actually permit. Ellen manages this balance with real grace, in Margaret's estimation, though it is not something Margaret has ever said aloud, because saying it aloud would itself disturb the careful, comfortable distance both women have settled into across 11 years of this exact arrangement. There is warmth between them, genuine warmth, built from thousands of small shared moments exactly like tonight's hair brushing, but there is also a boundary that neither woman would think to cross, a boundary as real and as carefully maintained as the walls of the house itself. I mentioned earlier that a single candle burns beside Margaret's bed tonight, snuffed out gently just before sleep, and it is worth spending a little time on the question of light itself, because the 1870s sit at a peculiar transitional moment in the history of how houses like this one were lit after dark, and this particular household's choices tell you something specific about its character. Gas lighting had, by this point in the decade, become common enough in fashionable London townhouses and in the grandest aristocratic residences, piped in from a central supply and burned through fixed wall fittings that produced a steadier, brighter light than any candle or oil lamp could manage. But gas installation was expensive, and it required a level of infrastructure, proper piping run through walls already built for an earlier era that many country houses, even wealthy ones, had not yet undertaken by this point in the decade. This particular house has gas downstairs, in the main hall and the principal reception rooms where guests are most likely to be impressed by its modern brightness, but the upper floors, the family bedrooms, and the servants' quarters alike still rely on the older combination of oil lamps and candles that had served English households for generations before gas arrived at all. There is something almost poetic in that arrangement, if you think about it the right way. The most public parts of the house reaching eagerly toward modernity, while the most private parts, the bedrooms where the household's actual intimate life unfolds, remain lit by the same soft, warm, flickering light that would have been entirely familiar to Margaret's grandmother in her own bedroom half a century earlier. Oil lamps, burning a refined mineral oil rather than the older, smokier whale oil or animal fat that earlier generations relied on, produce a light that is brighter and steadier than a candle, but still fundamentally warm and golden, rather than the harder white brightness that gas, and later electricity, would eventually bring even to bedrooms like this one within another decade or two. Candles themselves have their own small hierarchy in a house like this, and it is not something Margaret would ever think to notice consciously, though it shapes her evening more than she realizes. The candle beside her bed tonight is beeswax, pale cream-coloured, burning clean and nearly odourless, considerably more expensive than the tallow candles used in less visible parts of the house, in the servants' quarters and the working areas below stairs, where the cheaper wax renders a smokier flame and a faintly unpleasant animal smell that the family would never tolerate in their own rooms, but that Sarah and Alice have grown so accustomed to over years of exposure that they barely register it as unpleasant at all anymore. The oil lamp itself, the one that provided the room's main light through the earlier part of the evening, before Margaret finally extinguished it in favour of the single candle, sits now on its table with its wick trimmed and its reservoir topped up, ready for tomorrow evening's use, and there is a particular ritual attached to its maintenance that falls, like so much else in this house, to whoever holds responsibility for this specific room. The glass chimney must be cleaned regularly, wiped free of the faint soot that oil lamps inevitably produce, even when burning cleanly, and the wick trimmed to exactly the right length, too long, and the flame smokes and flickers unpleasantly, too short, and the light grows dim and yellow rather than bright and clear. This is one of Sarah's regular weekly tasks, performed with the same careful attention she brings to everything else in this bedroom, and it is easy to overlook how much specific, learned skill even something as simple as good lamplight actually required in this particular decade of English domestic life. Fire itself, of course, provides its own light throughout the evening, and there is a particular quality to a room lit primarily by firelight that neither lamp nor candle nor gas quite replicates, a warm, restless, shifting illumination that never holds perfectly still, shadows lengthening and shortening across the walls as the flames rise and fall, the whole room seeming to breathe gently in time with the fire's own rhythm. Margaret has spent enough evenings in rooms lit this way that she barely notices it consciously anymore, but there is something in that particular quality of light, warm and alive and never quite fixed, that I think explains part of why these rooms feel as genuinely cozy as they do, beyond simple temperature, beyond simple softness. Light itself in a house like this one still moved and flickered and cast long shifting shadows the way it had for centuries before, not yet flattened into the fixed even brightness that electricity would eventually bring to bedrooms everywhere, Margaret's own included, within another 20 or 30 years, changing something subtle but real about how a bedroom actually felt after dark. The nightgown Margaret wears tonight, that high-necked garment of fine white lawn cotton trimmed with lace, represents a particular moment in a much longer history of how women of her class dressed for sleep, and it is worth understanding a little of that history because it shapes exactly why her nightwear looks and feels the way it does. Earlier generations of wealthy English women, Margaret's own grandmother among them, slept in considerably simpler garments, plain cotton or linen shifts with little in the way of decoration, the whole concept of nightwear as a category deserving of aesthetic attention being a relatively recent development by the standards of the 1870s. What changed gradually across the middle decades of the century was a growing Victorian emphasis on modesty and propriety, extending even into the private, unobserved hours of sleep, a cultural anxiety that a woman should present herself with a certain decorum even alone in her own bed, which produced nightgowns that grew progressively more covering, higher at the neck, longer at the wrist and ankle than the simpler garments of earlier generations. At the same time, and this is the part I find genuinely interesting, this same modest coverage became an opportunity for its own kind of quiet luxury and self-expression, precisely because a woman of Margaret's means could afford to have that modest coverage rendered in the finest available fabric, trimmed with real lace rather than the cheaper imitation lace available to less wealthy households, monogrammed sometimes with her own initials worked in delicate embroidery by a needlewoman paid specifically for this purpose. Modesty, in other words, did not mean plainness for a woman like Margaret. It simply redirected where the luxury showed itself, from visible display to private, personal indulgence, a nightgown that no one but herself, and perhaps Ellen, and perhaps eventually her husband, would ever actually see. The dressing gown she wears over it, that quilted plum-coloured garment that felt, she thought earlier this evening, almost like being wrapped in a small blanket, represents its own smaller category of Victorian domestic fashion, a garment that exists in the particular liminal space between fully dressed and fully undressed, appropriate for the private hours of morning and evening spent within her own rooms, but never, under any circumstances, appropriate for anywhere a guest or a male member of staff other than perhaps the elderly family physician might see her. Its quilting is functional as much as decorative, thin layers of wool wadding stitched between two layers of silk to create genuine warmth without excessive bulk, a garment engineered in its own 19th century way, with real attention to the practical problem of staying warm in an English country house bedroom during the cooler months of the year. Dreams themselves occupied a curious place in the thinking of this era, somewhere between old folk superstition and emerging scientific interest, and it is worth a brief mention here, if only because Margaret, like most women of her generation, holds a set of half-examined beliefs about her own dreaming that would strike a modern listener as a strange but rather charming mixture of both. Household advice literature and popular magazines of the period sometimes included small sections on dream interpretation, treating certain recurring dream images, water, falling, particular animals, as carrying loose symbolic meanings worth noting, though most educated households of Margaret's class treated this more as pleasant parlour entertainment than as anything approaching genuine belief. At the same time, a more serious and specifically Victorian anxiety existed around what dreams revealed about a person's moral and physical health. The idea that troubled, restless, or unpleasant dreams might indicate an overtaxed nervous system, poor digestion, or insufficient exercise, a connection between mental and physical well-being that, however unscientific its particular explanations, was not entirely wrong in its basic instinct that body and mind influence each other's rest. Margaret does not remember most mornings what she dreamed the night before, and tonight will likely be no different, whatever images move through her sleeping mind over the coming hours, dissolving quietly by the time Ellen draws back the curtains at 6:30. This is, I think, simply the ordinary fate of most dreams, remembered by almost no one in any real detail, and there is something worth appreciating in that too, the way a mind can spend an entire night working through whatever private, wordless business dreams attend to, and then release all of it so completely by morning that not even the dreamer herself retains any real record of where she has been. Let me take you back, for a moment, earlier in the evening, to the butler's final circuit of the ground floor rooms, because I mentioned it briefly before, and I think it deserves a fuller telling, since it represents its own quiet, careful ritual running parallel to everything happening upstairs in Margaret's bedroom. His name is Mr. Halloran, and he has served this household for nearly 15 years, rising to his current position after beginning, like so many in service, in a considerably more junior role decades earlier in a different house entirely. His final rounds each night follow a sequence nearly as fixed and as practiced as Sarah's bedroom preparation, though the specific tasks differ considerably. He begins in the dining room, checking that the fire there has been properly banked rather than left to burn unattended, that the sideboard has been cleared and the silver locked away in its designated cabinet, a small but genuinely important security measure in a house that owns a considerable quantity of valuable plate. From there he moves to the drawing room, checking the French doors leading out to the terrace, testing each one with a firm hand to ensure the bolt has caught properly, and then to the library, where the family's most valuable books and a small collection of paintings hang, checking windows there as well before moving on to the smaller morning room, and finally back through the main hall itself. At each stop he carries a single lamp held at chest height, and the effect, if you were watching from some hidden vantage point, would be almost theatrical, a solitary figure moving slowly through a series of darkened, elegant rooms, his circle of lamplight briefly illuminating a painting, a piece of furniture, the gleam of a brass door handle, before moving on and leaving the room to settle back into full darkness behind him. There is a particular seriousness to this task that Mr. Halloran brings to it every single night, regardless of how uneventful the previous several thousand nights have been, because the entire point of this kind of careful, repeated vigilance is that it only needs to fail once for real consequence to follow. He has never, in 15 years, found anything genuinely alarming during these rounds. No forced window, no unlatched door left carelessly open by a careless housemaid. But the absence of trouble is itself, in a strange way, evidence that the ritual works rather than evidence that it was ever unnecessary. His own bedroom, once these rounds are finished, sits in a small suite of rooms near the pantry, a position of some privilege among the male staff, roughly equivalent in comfort to Mrs. Fenwick's own quarters near the kitchen, reflecting his seniority within the household hierarchy. He sleeps, most nights, with the particular soundness of a man whose conscience is genuinely clear about having done his job thoroughly, though he wakes, as Mrs. Fenwick does, at the smallest unfamiliar sound, an old habit that 15 years of responsibility has worn permanently into his sleeping mind. I think there is something worth noticing in how many different careful practiced rituals converge on this one household every single night. Sarah's bedroom preparation, Mr. Halloran's security rounds, Mrs. Fenwick's resource management, each of them separate, each of them largely invisible to the others, and yet all of them working together toward exactly the same shared outcome. A house that feels, to the family sleeping within it, entirely safe, entirely warm, entirely undisturbed by any of the effort required to make it so. The economics underlying all of this comfort are worth a brief, honest mention too, because the coal that warms Margaret's bedroom tonight, and the candles and lamp oil that light it, and the wages that pay Sarah and Ellen and Mrs. Fenwick and Mr. Halloran, all draw from the same finite household budget, and the choices made about how generously to distribute that budget across different rooms and different people reveal, with a kind of quiet honesty that polite conversation rarely allows, exactly how this household ranks the relative importance of different kinds of comfort. A ton of coal in this decade cost a genuinely significant sum, and a large country house like this one might burn through many tons across a single winter, warming not just Margaret's bedroom, but a dozen other rooms besides: the drawing room, the dining room, the library, the hallways and staircases that connect them all. Poorer households, cottagers and labourers living in the small stone cottages visible from the estate's boundary walls, budgeted their much smaller coal allowance with far greater care, often keeping only a single room genuinely warm through the winter evening, retiring to cold bedrooms bundled in every blanket and article of clothing the household owned. A version of an English winter night that Margaret has never experienced firsthand and likely never will. This is not a comparison I make to diminish what Margaret has tonight, exactly, but I think it is worth holding both pictures in your mind at once, because it tells you something true about what wealth actually purchased in this era, more than gowns, more than jewellery, more even than social position itself. Wealth purchased warmth. It purchased the ability to sleep through a cold October night without ever once feeling the cold at all, and that particular purchase, invisible and unglamorous as it sounds when you say it plainly like this, may have been one of the most genuinely valuable things money could buy in 19th century England. I want to return for a little while to the bed itself, because I think there is more worth saying about how a bed like Margaret's came to exist at all, the slow accumulated history compressed into those layers of horsehair and wool and feather that we described so carefully at the very start of tonight's story. A century earlier, even a genuinely wealthy English woman's bed would have looked and felt meaningfully different from the one Margaret sleeps in tonight, not because earlier generations valued comfort less, but because the available materials and construction methods were simply less refined. Feather beds existed for centuries before Margaret's time, but the fabric used to contain those feathers, the tightness of the weave, the quality of the down itself, all improved gradually across the decades leading up to her own lifetime, driven partly by advances in textile manufacturing and partly by an expanding trade network that brought finer down from further afield, some of it sourced from as far as continental Europe, selected specifically for its lightness and its capacity to loft back into shape after being compressed. The iron springs beneath the mattress, mentioned earlier as a relatively recent installation in this particular household, represent an even more specifically 19th century innovation: coiled steel springs woven into a supportive base that replaced the older rope lattice work entirely, providing a more even, more durable support than rope ever managed, rope having an unfortunate tendency to stretch and sag unevenly over years of use, requiring periodic tightening with a special key that most households kept for exactly this purpose. Margaret's own bed received this upgrade only 6 or 7 years ago, during a broader refurbishment of the upper floor bedrooms, and Ellen still occasionally mentions, with a kind of mild wonder, how much more evenly the mattress holds its shape now, compared to the older rope-framed bed Margaret slept on for the first years of her marriage. None of this technology was available at all to Margaret's grandmother in her own youth, and none of it was available to the vast majority of English households outside the wealthiest few percent, which is worth remembering whenever we are tempted to flatten the entire Victorian era into a single uniform experience. The truth is considerably more layered than that. Technology and comfort trickling gradually downward through the social hierarchy across decades, available first and most fully to households exactly like Margaret's, and reaching further down the social scale only slowly, incompletely, and often in cheaper, less refined versions of the same basic innovation. The separate bedroom arrangement Margaret shares with her husband, mentioned earlier, deserves a slightly fuller explanation too, because it reflects a genuinely widespread pattern among English households of this class and era, though not a universal one, and the reasoning behind it was considerably more practical than romantic distance might suggest. Dressing and undressing in this period involved an elaborate, time-consuming process on both sides, Margaret's own routine requiring Ellen's assistance for the better part of half an hour most evenings, her husband's requiring his own valet for a somewhat shorter but still considerable stretch of time, and maintaining 2 separate rooms allowed both processes to happen simultaneously rather than one spouse waiting idle while the other completed an elaborate toilet. There was also frankly a genuine Victorian value placed on a certain kind of personal privacy even within marriage, a belief that a husband and wife each benefited from having one space entirely their own, free of the other's habits and preferences, where reading late or rising early, or simply existing in whatever state of undress or disarray one preferred would trouble no one else. This arrangement was admittedly available mainly to households wealthy enough to spare the additional bedroom in the first place, a working class or even solidly middle class household typically having no such luxury of space. Husband and wife, and often several children sharing a single room out of simple necessity, which meant that this particular version of Victorian marital privacy was, like so much else we have discussed tonight, a privilege available specifically to households of Margaret's means, rather than any kind of universal English domestic pattern. A particular quality of true darkness belongs to this hour too, one that almost no one alive today has ever fully experienced, and Margaret's bedroom tonight, sealed behind its heavy curtains in a house standing alone in open countryside miles from the nearest town, comes about as close to it as anywhere still does. No street lamp glow seeps around the edges of her curtains. No distant illuminated window from a neighbouring house interrupts the blackness beyond the glass, the nearest other dwelling being the gamekeeper's cottage a good half-mile off through the woods, its own small light long since extinguished for the night. When the fire finally burns down to nothing but a faint red glow among grey ash sometime after 2 in the morning, the darkness in this room becomes close to absolute, a depth of black that modern eyes, accustomed to the constant low-level glow of a world lit through the night by electricity, would likely find almost disorienting at first, before the body's own ancient, mostly forgotten comfort with genuine darkness reasserts itself. I think this matters more than it might seem to at first, this quality of true darkness, because sleep itself responds to it in ways the Victorians understood only instinctively, without any of the scientific language we might use today to describe how darkness signals a body's internal clock to release the particular hormones that deepen and sustain sleep. Margaret does not know any of this, could not have named any of it, but her body knows it perfectly well, settling into a depth of rest that a modern sleeper, surrounded by the persistent electronic glow of clocks and screens and streetlights seeping through thin curtains, might genuinely envy without quite understanding why. The clock in the main hall continues its steady work through all of this, its pendulum swinging behind glass, marking hours that almost no one in the sleeping house consciously registers, and yet the whole rhythm of tomorrow depends on its accuracy in a way worth appreciating. Mr. Halloran winds it personally each Sunday evening, a small weekly ritual that falls specifically to him rather than to any other member of staff, checking its time against his own pocket watch, itself set periodically against the time given at the nearest railway station, since railway time, standardized across the whole country only within the past few decades, has become the closest thing this era possesses to a single reliable national clock. Every other timepiece in the house takes its cue, directly or indirectly, from this one hall clock. The kitchen clock is checked against it. Mrs. Fenwick's own small clock in her sitting room is checked against it. Even Sarah and Martha, without owning watches of their own, have learnt to gauge the hour roughly from the quality of light through a window, or from the particular chime, muffled by distance, carrying up through the house at each full hour, a soft, distant, 4-note phrase from the hall clock's mechanism that Margaret, deep in dreamless sleep right now, does not consciously hear at all, but that has, across 11 years of living in this house, become woven so thoroughly into the background texture of her nights that its absence, on the rare occasions the clock has needed repair, would likely unsettle her more than its presence ever does. I mentioned earlier the modest remedies available to this household on nights when sleep proved difficult, and I want to return to that for a moment, because there is more texture worth adding to it. The warm milk sometimes brought up on such nights is not simply milk most often, but milk gently warmed with a small measure of honey stirred through it, sometimes with a pinch of nutmeg grated fresh across the top, a preparation that Mrs. Fenwick learnt from her own mother decades ago and has passed down in turn to whichever housemaid currently holds the night duty rota. The lavender water kept in a small glass bottle on Margaret's dressing table was distilled from lavender grown in the estate's own kitchen garden, cut and dried each July by the under-gardener specifically for this purpose. A few careful drops sprinkled on a pillow believed, in the household wisdom of the period, to encourage a calmer, gentler descent into sleep. Whether through genuine physiological effect or simple pleasant association, no one in this house particularly troubles themselves to distinguish. For more serious or persistent sleeplessness, the family physician, a Dr. Pemberton who has attended this household for many years, kept a small, carefully rationed supply of stronger remedies available for genuine need, though it is worth being honest about how this era understood such things. Chloral hydrate, prescribed occasionally for real insomnia, was considered a modern respectable medical solution in this decade, understood as safer and more reliable than the older reliance on straight laudanum, though we know now, with the considerable benefit of a century and a half of additional medical understanding, that both carried genuine risks the period's own doctors only partially appreciated. Dr. Pemberton, to his credit, prescribed sparingly and monitored carefully, a caution not every physician of this era exercised with equal discipline, and Margaret herself has needed such assistance perhaps 3 or 4 times in her entire adult life, each time for genuine and passing distress rather than any habitual reliance, a distinction the household and Margaret herself took seriously. The house itself deserves a little more attention than we have given it so far tonight, because so much of what makes Margaret's comfort possible comes down to decisions made not by her or by anyone currently living within these walls, but by the people who built and shaped this house across generations before she ever arrived here as a young bride. It was built originally in the late 17th century, a good 200 years before tonight's story, by an earlier generation of the same family, though it has been altered and expanded so many times since then that very little of that original structure remains visible from the outside. A major renovation in the early part of this current century added the wing where Margaret's own bedroom now sits, replacing an older, colder, considerably less comfortable section of the house that her husband's grandfather judged, correctly as it happens, to be no longer suitable for a family of their standing. The walls in this newer wing are thick, built from local stone quarried not 5 miles from where the house stands, and that thickness matters more than you might immediately think, because stone this substantial holds heat and resists cold with a kind of passive stubbornness that lighter, more modern construction methods simply cannot replicate. The windows themselves, tall and generously proportioned to let in as much daylight as possible during the shorter days of an English winter, represent their own small compromise between beauty and practicality, glass this large being considerably harder to keep properly sealed against drafts than a smaller, older-style window would be, which is part of why the heavy curtains matter so much, not merely for privacy or decoration, but as a genuinely functional barrier against the cold that inevitably seeps, however slightly, through even well-fitted Victorian glass. Margaret's own bedroom was redecorated 4 years ago, shortly before her daughter was born, in anticipation of the changes a growing family would bring to the household's routines, and she remembers the process with a mixture of genuine pleasure and mild exhaustion, weeks spent selecting fabric samples and wallpaper patterns, with a decorator brought down from London specifically for the purpose, swatches of the fern-patterned paper eventually chosen laid out across the very bed we have spent so much of tonight's story describing, compared against different qualities of light at different times of day, before a final decision was reached. The wine-coloured counterpane, the deep green bed curtains, the particular shade of the wallpaper itself, none of it was chosen carelessly or quickly, and there is something worth appreciating in that too, the sheer deliberateness with which a room like this one comes to feel the way it feels, every colour and texture considered against every other, the whole space composed with the same careful attention a painter might bring to a canvas, except that this particular canvas exists to be lived in, slept in, returned to every single night for years and years until its patterns and colours become so familiar they barely register consciously at all anymore, simply forming the comfortable, unremarkable backdrop of an ordinary life. Downstairs, in the small sitting room where Margaret spent her earlier evening writing letters, a different set of careful decisions shapes a different kind of comfort, this one social rather than purely physical. The room is smaller and considerably less formal than the grand drawing room used for entertaining proper guests, furnished with pieces chosen more for comfort than for impressing visitors, a worn but genuinely comfortable armchair positioned near the window where the afternoon light falls best for reading, a small writing desk angled to catch the last of the daylight without requiring a lamp until well into the evening. This is, in a real sense, Margaret's own private domain within the larger household, the one room in the house she has shaped almost entirely according to her own taste and habit, rather than any broader consideration of how it might appear to outside eyes, and there is a particular kind of freedom in that which she values more than she would probably admit aloud, even to Ellen. The piano occupies one corner of this same small sitting room, an instrument she plays with genuine skill, though rarely for any audience beyond herself these days, her earlier ambitions toward more serious musical accomplishment having settled, over the years of marriage and motherhood, into something gentler and more private, an hour spent working through a familiar piece not to impress anyone, but simply because the particular concentration it requires offers its own quiet form of rest, not unlike the reading she does later in the evening beside her bedroom fire, both activities serving the same underlying purpose of occupying her mind, gently enough to ease the transition from the day's more demanding hours toward the eventual stillness of sleep. Beyond the walls of the house, the formal garden that Margaret can see from her window during daylight hours lies now in complete darkness, its careful geometric beds of roses long since finished blooming for the year, cut back and mulched against the coming winter by the head gardener and his small team of under-gardeners earlier this same month. A gravel path winds between the beds toward a small stone fountain, silent now, its water shut off and drained weeks ago as a precaution against the freezing temperatures that will arrive properly within the coming weeks, and beyond that, a low box hedge marks the boundary between the formal garden and the wilder parkland that stretches toward the woods where the gamekeeper made his rounds earlier tonight. A thin crescent moon hangs somewhere above all of this, visible only occasionally through gaps in the clouds that have been drifting steadily eastward since the rain finally cleared sometime after midnight, its faint silver light catching, now and then, on the wet grass and the last few clinging leaves of the beech trees lining the drive. There is a particular stillness to a garden at this hour that even the most careful daytime observer never quite experiences, every plant and path and stone fountain holding exactly the position it held at dusk, waiting, in its own patient vegetable way, for the light to return and the household's daily rhythms to begin moving through it again. I find myself thinking, whenever I picture this exact scene, about how many separate small worlds exist within the boundaries of a single estate like this one, all operating simultaneously and mostly independently through these same dark hours, the garden waiting in its patient stillness, the stable yard where the horses shift occasionally in their sleep, the kitchen garden with its neat rows of winter vegetables, cabbages and leeks and the last of the season's root crops, standing untended and unwatched until morning, the woods where a fox, unseen by anyone, moves silently along a familiar path toward the henhouse it has learned, through repeated failed attempts, not to bother approaching too closely, the gamekeeper's vigilance having taught it caution across several previous encounters. Margaret's daughter, sleeping soundly now in the nursery after her brief 2 o'clock waking, will grow up within this same layered world of visible comfort and invisible labour, and it occurs to me to wonder, sometimes, how much of it she will eventually come to understand as she gets older, whether she will grow into the same comfortable, mostly unexamined acceptance her mother holds, or whether some part of her, perhaps prompted by a particular teacher or a particular book, or simply the ordinary curiosity of childhood, will someday ask the kind of question that makes the whole elaborate structure suddenly visible in a way it rarely is to those who benefit from it most directly. Children ask those questions sometimes, in my experience, more readily than adults do, not yet having learnt the comfortable adult habit of simply not looking too closely at the mechanisms behind their own good fortune. Dr. Pemberton, mentioned a little earlier in connection with the household's sleep remedies, keeps his own modest medical practice in the nearest market town, some 6 miles distant, and attends this household, along with perhaps a dozen others of similar standing scattered across the surrounding countryside, along with a considerably larger number of less wealthy patients whose visits he charges according to a sliding scale that reflects, honestly if somewhat uncomfortably, the same social hierarchy that shapes every other aspect of this era's daily life. His medical bag, kept always ready by his own bedside for exactly the kind of urgent night summons that occasionally comes, holds a modest collection of instruments and remedies that would look almost quaint by any later century's medical standards, though they represented genuinely current best practice for this particular decade, laudanum and chloral hydrate among them, alongside simpler remedies, willow bark for fever, various tinctures for digestive complaint, the whole collection reflecting a medical profession still working, often with real dedication and real intelligence, within the considerable limits of what this era actually understood about the human body. Tonight no summons comes for him. His own sleep, in his own modest but comfortable house in the market town, proceeds entirely undisturbed, and Margaret's household continues its quiet, uneventful night without any need of his particular expertise at all, which is, in its own understated way, exactly the outcome every household hopes for on every single ordinary night, illness and emergency remaining, for this one evening at least, entirely theoretical concerns rather than actual demands on anyone's attention or rest. If you were to stand at the end of the long drive tonight, looking back toward the house through the thinning mist, you would see very little to suggest that anything inside is happening at all. A single faint light, Sarah's candle perhaps, or the last glow of Mr. Halloran's lamp before he too retires, might show briefly in an upper window before disappearing again, and otherwise the whole long facade of grey stone would present itself as a dark, silent, largely featureless shape against the slightly less dark sky behind it, chimneys rising in a row along the roofline, each one marking a fireplace that, at various points this same evening, held some version of the warmth we have spent so long describing tonight. There is something almost eerie in that image. Honestly, the outward stillness of a house that is, on the inside, so carefully, continuously active even at this hour. Fires being checked, a nursery maid dozing lightly with one ear tuned toward a sleeping child, Mrs. Fenwick surfacing briefly from her own sleep at some small unfamiliar sound before settling again. None of that inner activity shows itself from the drive, and I think this mismatch between a house's quiet exterior and its genuinely busy interior life captures something true about privilege in this era more broadly, the way wealth so often prefers to present itself as effortless stillness while concealing, quite deliberately, the considerable motion required to produce that impression. The neighbouring farmhouse, visible in daylight from Margaret's own window, as a small cluster of buildings perhaps a mile distant across the fields, tells a rather different story tonight, though Margaret has never had much reason to think carefully about it. A tenant family lives there, farming land that ultimately belongs to Margaret's husband's estate, and their own version of this same October night looks considerably simpler. One shared bedroom for the parents and the youngest children, older boys sleeping in a loft space above the kitchen, a single fire banked in the kitchen hearth, providing what warmth the whole modest house receives overnight. No separate bedroom fires, no warming pans, no lady's maid brushing anyone's hair by candlelight. This is not deprivation exactly, not by this family's own understanding of their circumstances, which are genuinely comfortable relative to many other rural households of this era, but it is, undeniably, a different scale of comfort entirely from what Margaret experiences as simply ordinary. I want to return briefly to the question of what a comparable night looked like just one social rung below Margaret's own, not the tenant farmhouse we visited earlier, considerably poorer, but a solidly comfortable middle-class household, a lawyer's family perhaps, or a prosperous merchant's, living in a good-sized house in a nearby market town, because the comparison sharpens something about Margaret's own particular experience that is easy to miss when we only compare her to the very poor. Such a household would very likely own a feather bed too, and fine enough linen, and a fire in the main bedroom on cold nights. The basic materials of comfort were not entirely beyond middle-class reach by this point in the century, mass production and an expanding retail trade having brought fine fabric and manufactured furniture within striking distance of households considerably less wealthy than Margaret's own. What such a household would almost certainly lack, though, is exactly what we have spent so much of tonight examining, the layer of dedicated live-in labour that makes comfort feel effortless rather than merely achievable through one's own direct effort. In that lawyer's household, the fire in the main bedroom might well be lit, but likely by the lady of the house herself, or by a single overworked general maid managing an entire household's needs virtually alone, rather than by a housemaid whose full-time responsibility is precisely this one task among a small handful of others. The linen might be nearly as fine, but it would be laundered less frequently, mended more visibly, replaced less readily when it finally wore thin. The warming pan might exist in the household inventory, but it might not be used every single night as a matter of course, reserved instead for the coldest nights specifically, a small luxury rationed rather than assumed. The difference, in other words, was never purely about the objects themselves. Margaret's mattress and Sarah's careful attention to it are both real, but it is specifically the combination of fine materials and abundant dedicated labour that produces the particular seamless, effortless quality of Margaret's nightly comfort, a combination that required not just money for goods, but money for people, an entire staff large enough that no single servant needed to divide her attention across too many competing tasks at once. This is in the end probably the truest dividing line in Victorian domestic comfort, not simply what a household could afford to own, but how many hands it could afford to employ in the ongoing, continuous work of making that ownership feel effortless. I raise this comparison not to make you feel guilty on Margaret's behalf, sitting warm in your own bed tonight listening to this story, but because I think it deepens rather than diminishes the picture we have built together across this whole long night. Comfort, real physical comfort of exactly the kind we have spent so many hours describing, was never universal in this era, and understanding how unevenly it was distributed makes the specific, careful, considerable effort involved in producing Margaret's version of it feel more vivid rather than less, more worth noticing rather than less. Sundays bring their own particular shift to this household's rhythm, worth a brief mention here since we have spent this whole story inside a single ordinary weeknight. The household rises somewhat later on Sunday mornings, breakfast pushed back to accommodate church attendance, the family and much of the staff walking or riding the short distance to the small parish church that has served this estate for generations, its own graveyard holding several previous generations of Margaret's husband's family beneath modest weathered headstones. Sunday evenings tend toward an even quieter version of the ordinary evening we have watched tonight, less correspondence, more simple rest, and Margaret's bedtime ritual on a Sunday night carries a particular unhurried quality that even her already unhurried weeknight version cannot quite match, the whole household easing into its one weekly day of genuinely reduced obligation before Monday's demands, the great wash chief among them, return the household to its ordinary busy rhythm. Even the servants feel this weekly shift, though considerably less generously than the family does. Sunday brings most of the staff a single half-day of genuine rest, usually the afternoon, a few hours to walk to the village, write a letter home, or simply sit quietly in the servants' hall without any particular task demanding attention. Sarah spends most of her own Sunday afternoons this way, and there is a particular value she places on those few unstructured hours that Margaret, whose every day carries some version of unstructured freedom, could probably never fully appreciate. A single quiet afternoon means something different to a person who has so little of it than it does to a person who has, relatively speaking, so much. She usually spends part of it writing to her own family, the farmer parents and 5 siblings she left behind 4 years ago, and part of it simply sitting with Alice in the small patch of garden set aside for staff use, doing nothing in particular, which is, for both of them, most of the point. A small square of grass and a low wooden bench tucked behind the kitchen wall, out of sight of the main house entirely, theirs alone, in a way almost nothing else in this house could ever quite be said to be. A small, unremarkable corner of the world, claimed entirely and quietly for themselves, one modest hour a week that belongs, quietly and entirely, to no one else at all. There is a family portrait gallery running along the upper landing outside Margaret's bedroom door. A long corridor lined with painted likenesses of her husband's ancestors, stretching back nearly 2 centuries, and she passes beneath their painted gazes every single night on her way to bed without much conscious thought. Though occasionally, on nights when sleep proves elusive, she has found herself pausing before one particular portrait, a woman from perhaps 3 generations back, whose expression, captured by some now largely forgotten portrait painter, carries a quality of quiet, private amusement that Margaret finds strangely companionable, as though this long-dead woman understood something about the particular experience of living within this house that no one currently alive quite shares with her. Let us return one more time to the bedroom itself, because I think it is worth simply sitting quietly with Margaret for a while longer before the household begins properly stirring toward morning, watching nothing much happen at all, which is, after all, exactly what sleep is supposed to look like from the outside. She has shifted position twice more since we last checked on her, first turning fully onto her side sometime around 1 in the morning, drawing her knees up slightly in the particular curled posture she has favoured since childhood, and then again closer to 3, stretching briefly before settling onto her back once more, one arm resting above the covers now, the other tucked beneath her pillow. None of this movement disturbs her sleep in any meaningful way. It is simply what a resting body does across a long night, adjusting itself periodically without ever fully surfacing to conscious awareness, the kind of small unconscious choreography that happens identically whether a person sleeps in a feather bed layered with silk and linen, or on a straw-filled tick in a servant's plain attic room 3 floors above. Her breathing has settled into the slow, even rhythm of genuinely deep sleep, the kind that would be visible if you watched closely enough in the faint remaining glow of the fire, in the gentle rise and fall of the counterpane across her chest. This is, I think, one of the quietly beautiful things about sleep generally, the way it strips away, at least temporarily, so much of what separates one sleeping body from another. Margaret asleep looks, in this most basic physical sense, remarkably similar to Sarah asleep 3 floors above her, or to the small child asleep in the nursery down the hall, or to any other sleeping person anywhere in England on this same October night. The elaborate social architecture that governs every waking hour of Margaret's life, the corsets and the calling cards and the careful gradations of who may speak to whom and in what tone, all of it dissolves, at least for these several hours, into the simple, universal, entirely democratic fact of a body at rest. The fire, meanwhile, continues its own slow, patient decline, and there is a particular craft to how well a fire has been banked that reveals itself only across these many hours of unwatched burning. Sarah built this fire with real skill earlier tonight, coal arranged carefully rather than simply piled, enough air allowed to circulate that the fire would burn steadily rather than smother itself prematurely, and the evidence of that skill shows now in how gradually and evenly it has declined, glowing steadily rather than guttering out in fits and starts, the way a carelessly built fire sometimes does. This is not a small thing, this particular competence, though it would never occur to Margaret to notice or credit it directly. A poorly banked fire means a cold room by 3 in the morning rather than by 5, an entire extra hour of chill that a skilled housemaid's careful work simply prevents from ever happening at all. By 3:30, the fire has reduced to little more than a faint constellation of glowing embers scattered across a bed of grey ash, giving off almost no visible light now, though the room retains, as we discussed earlier, enough residual warmth from the evening's fuller blaze and from the insulating mass of curtains and walls and heavy bedding that Margaret remains entirely comfortable beneath her layers. This is the coldest point of the whole night, this narrow window between 3:30 and the first stirrings of Martha's own waking an hour later, and even at this coldest moment, Margaret's bedroom sits meaningfully warmer than the outside air, a testament less to the fire itself, mostly spent by now, than to everything else, the walls and curtains and bedding, working together in quiet accumulated concert. I keep returning to this idea of accumulated small effort throughout tonight's story, because I think it is genuinely the truest thing I can tell you about what comfort actually was in this particular era, in a house like this one. Not a single grand luxury, not one impressive object or gesture, but hundreds of small careful decisions and small careful hands, working across a single evening and repeated, essentially unchanged, across thousands of previous evenings before this one. Each small contribution invisible on its own, and yet added together, producing something that felt, to the person receiving it, simply like an ordinary, unremarkable, deeply comfortable night's sleep. There is a word the Victorians used constantly, in their letters and their household manuals and their casual conversation, that carries slightly different weight now than it did then, and that word is comfort itself. For Margaret's generation, comfort was not simply a private physical sensation, pleasant but ultimately trivial. It carried real moral and social weight, understood as both a marker of respectability and, in its own quiet way, almost a duty, the properly run household being one that provided genuine physical comfort to its family members as a visible sign of good management, good breeding, and appropriate care. A household that failed to keep its family members warm, well-fed, and properly rested was understood, in this era's own terms, as failing at something more significant than mere hospitality. It reflected poorly on the head of the household, suggested carelessness, or inadequate means, or simple bad management, and this is part of why so much careful attention went into exactly the kind of details we have spent this whole story exploring, not purely for pleasure's sake, though pleasure played its own real part, but because comfort itself functioned as a kind of visible evidence, proof that this household understood its own responsibilities and discharged them properly. This helps explain, I think, why the labour behind Margaret's comfort was expected to remain so thoroughly invisible, why Sarah worked so quietly, why the whole elaborate preparation of the bedroom happened entirely out of Margaret's sight. A household's comfort was meant to appear effortless, specifically because effort itself, visible effort, would have suggested inadequate resources, insufficient staff, a family struggling to maintain the standard expected of their position. The invisibility of the labour was not incidental to the comfort. It was, in a real sense, part of what made the comfort count as genuine luxury at all, rather than simply adequate provision. Tomorrow night, this same sequence will unfold again, nearly identical in every particular, Sarah kneeling at the same grate, the same feather bed punched and turned, the same warming pans sliding beneath the same fine linen sheets, and the night after that, the same again, and the night after that, stretching backward through years already lived and forward through years not yet arrived, this household's nighttime rhythm repeating itself with such steady, unremarkable consistency that no single night, including this one, would ever have seemed particularly worth recording or remembering to anyone actually living through it. That is, I think, part of what makes tonight worth pausing on now, so many years later, listening to this story in whatever bed you have carried yourself into. An ordinary night in an ordinary wealthy household, unremarkable enough that it left no trace in any diary or letter, and yet carrying within its unremarkable ordinariness this entire elaborate structure of care and labour and craft that we have spent so long uncovering together. Most of history, if you think about it honestly, is made of exactly this kind of unremembered ordinariness, thousands upon thousands of nights just like this one, each one gone without record the moment it passed, and there is something worth treasuring in taking the time, occasionally, to imagine our way carefully back into one of them. The wider calendar of this household's year shapes these nights too, in ways worth briefly mentioning before we let this particular night finally draw toward its close. Spring brings a household emerging gradually from winter's heavier demands, fires needed less often, windows opened more generously, the whole rhythm of preparation growing lighter and less labour-intensive with each passing week. Summer, as we discussed earlier, transforms the bedroom nearly beyond recognition, fires unnecessary, lighter coverings replacing the heavy winter bedding, the household's attention shifting toward entirely different seasonal demands, haymaking on the estate's farms, the London season drawing some wealthy families away from their country houses entirely for weeks at a stretch. Autumn, the season we find ourselves in tonight, marks the household's gradual return to its heavier winter habits, fires relit, warming pans brought back into use, the whole elaborate machinery of warmth we have watched unfold tonight reassembling itself after months of comparative dormancy, and winter, deepest and coldest, demands the fullest version of everything we have described. Fires built earliest and burning longest, the household's entire resources most heavily committed to the single unglamorous task of keeping its occupants genuinely warm through the darkest, coldest stretch of the English year. Fine Irish linen like the sheets on Margaret's bed tonight, along with the wool blankets and the silk of the counterpane itself, each travelled a considerable distance before ever reaching this particular bedroom, and there is a whole hidden geography worth briefly acknowledging in that fact, a reminder that even the most intimate private details of Margaret's night connect outward to a much larger world she rarely thinks about directly. There is a particular ledger kept in this household, separate from Mrs. Fenwick's own careful accounts of coal and candle wax, that records something else entirely, the rotation of linen through its long cycle of use and washing and repair, and it is worth a brief mention here because it explains something about why Margaret's sheets feel exactly the way they feel tonight, rather than merely adequate. Each set of fine linen in this house is numbered, quietly, with a small embroidered mark in one corner invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it, and Mrs. Fenwick tracks which set has gone to which bedroom, how many times it has been washed, and roughly how much longer it can be expected to serve before the fabric grows too thin and delicate for continued use on a family bed, at which point it does not simply get discarded but gets demoted, quietly, to service in a guest bedroom, or eventually to the nursery, where a little more wear shows less and matters less, before finally, years later, being cut down into smaller pieces for household cleaning rags, nothing in this economy of fine fabric ever quite going entirely to waste. A set on Margaret's bed tonight has been in service for just under 3 years, well past new, but not yet approaching its eventual retirement, sitting at exactly the point in its working life where the fabric has softened beautifully, without yet showing any real thinning or wear, which is, if you think about it, rather precisely why it feels the way it feels against her skin tonight, not simply because it is expensive linen, but because it is expensive linen that has been used exactly the right number of times to reach its own particular peak of softness, a quality no amount of money alone can purchase directly, since it can only be earned through patient, accumulated use. I find something almost moving in that fact, honestly, the idea that the single most luxurious sensation of Margaret's whole night, that first moment of linen meeting skin, depends not purely on wealth but on time, on years of careful washing and careful use, on a whole slow history of prior nights that this particular set of sheets has already quietly lived through before tonight ever arrived. Comfort, once again, revealing itself as something built gradually rather than simply purchased outright. Its linen was woven in a mill in Belfast, from flax grown in fields not far from that same city, purchased through a wholesale merchant in London who supplies fine household textiles to families like Margaret's across the southern counties. The wool came from closer to home, sheep raised on the estate's own tenant farms, sheared each spring and sold at the local wool market, before eventually returning, in a roundabout way that Margaret has never particularly traced, as finished blankets woven at a mill in Yorkshire and sold back through the same London merchant. The silk of the counterpane travelled furthest of all, raw silk grown and processed in France, woven into fabric there, and imported through a specialist London warehouse that Margaret's own mother patronised for decades before passing the connection along to her daughter. This entire quiet network of farms and mills and merchants and warehouses, most of it invisible to Margaret, in exactly the same way the labour inside her own household remains invisible to her, exists purely to eventually produce this one specific outcome, a warm, beautiful, comfortable bed in a specific bedroom in the English countryside, and there is something almost dizzying, if you actually stop to trace it fully, in how much distant human effort converges on this one small, private, largely unremarked upon moment of a woman falling asleep on an ordinary October night. Sarah's own future within this household, and within domestic service more broadly, follows its own uncertain arc, one worth a brief mention here, since we have spent so much of tonight inside her present rather than her future. Most housemaids of this era do not remain in service indefinitely. Many marry within their late 20s, often to a tradesman or a farmer, or, occasionally, to a fellow servant, tailoring, and leave domestic work behind entirely to manage their own households instead. Some, like Ellen before her, move gradually upward through the service hierarchy itself, from housemaid toward lady's maid, or eventually, for the rare few with particular aptitude, toward a housekeeper's position much like Mrs. Fenwick's own. A smaller number remain in more junior positions their entire working lives, never marrying, never advancing, growing old within the same households, or moving between several over the decades, a path that offers steady if modest security, but little in the way of the independence or personal comfort that Margaret, 3 floors below Sarah's own attic room tonight, takes so entirely for granted. There is no formal pension awaiting any of these women at the end of their working lives, no guaranteed provision beyond whatever a particularly generous employer might choose to offer as a personal kindness after decades of loyal service, a small cottage on the estate perhaps, or a modest ongoing allowance, though such arrangements depended entirely on individual goodwill rather than any systematic entitlement. This is worth acknowledging honestly, without dwelling on it too heavily at this particular hour of the night, because it reflects one more way in which the elaborate comfort Margaret enjoys tonight rested on a foundation of considerably less security for the people who built and maintained it around her. Down near the servants' entrance at the side of the house, a small collection of boots and shoes sit waiting each night for the earliest morning attention, and this too is worth mentioning as one final small window into the household's invisible rhythm. Whoever holds the boot boy's duties, a junior position typically given to the youngest male servant in the household, rises even before Martha most mornings specifically to attend to this single unglamorous task, blacking and polishing every pair of boots and shoes left out by family members and senior staff alike the night before, a smell of boot polish and beeswax filling the small scullery passage well before dawn properly breaks, so that by the time anyone in the family actually needs their footwear, it will already be gleaming, ready, one more small piece of effortless comfort, assembled from labour no one upstairs will ever think to notice. The morning post, when it eventually arrives sometime after 7, will bring with it another small thread connecting this quiet household to the wider world beyond the estate's boundaries, letters and newspapers carried first by rail to the nearest station, and then the final few miles by a boy on horseback who makes this same journey 6 mornings a week, regardless of weather, rain or frost, or the thick October mist that has hung over these fields for much of tonight. Margaret's letter to her sister in Bath, sealed and set aside the previous evening before she climbed the stairs to bed, will travel the reverse journey sometime today, carried down to the front hall where the outgoing post waits in a small silver tray for the same boy to collect on his return trip, beginning its own several-day journey westward across the country toward a sister who has no idea, as she goes about her own ordinary morning in her own comfortable house, that a letter describing this exact quiet October evening is already on its way toward her. There is something worth appreciating in that small delay, that gap of several days between an ordinary evening lived and the eventual telling of it to someone else, a rhythm of correspondence considerably slower than anything familiar to a modern listener, but carrying its own particular pleasure, the anticipation of a letter's arrival, the careful composition of a reply, an entire relationship sustained across considerable distance through nothing more than ink and paper and the patient, reliable work of the postal service and the railway that made it possible. The newspaper, too, when it arrives, will carry news already several hours old by the time Margaret's household reads it, printed overnight in London and rushed by the earliest available train to reach country households like this one by mid-morning, a genuine marvel of the era's transportation and printing technology, even though it would strike a modern reader as impossibly slow, a full news cycle behind events almost by definition. Margaret's husband, wherever he currently sits in his rented London rooms, will read essentially the same news hours earlier than she does, a small but real asymmetry of information that separates the experience of city life from country life in this particular decade, one more thread in the whole complicated fabric of distance and connection that shapes this household's relationship to the wider world. None of this touches Margaret directly in these final hours before she wakes, deeply asleep as she remains, entirely unaware of letters travelling toward Bath, or newspapers rushing down from London, or any of the 1,000 small threads of connection and labour that will converge on her household again within the next few hours. She simply sleeps, warm and comfortable and undisturbed, exactly as she has slept for most of this long night, while the whole vast, patient machinery of an 1870s English country estate continues its quiet, careful work around her, indifferent to whether she notices any of it at all, content simply to keep functioning, night after night, comfort after comfort, whether or not anyone ever fully appreciates the scale of what it actually accomplishes. I skipped over something earlier that deserves a small return now, a quiet detail from Margaret's bedtime ritual that slipped past rather quickly in our first telling of it, and that is the particular care she takes of her own skin before finally closing her eyes each night, a small private ritual that Ellen assists with, but that Margaret has performed, in one form or another, since her own girlhood. After washing with the warm water and rosewater soap we described earlier, Margaret works a small amount of cold cream into her face and hands, a thick pale preparation made from beeswax and almond oil and rosewater, mixed by the household's own cook according to a recipe passed down through at least 2 generations of the family, kept in a small covered china pot on the dressing table and replenished every few months as needed. This is understood, in the household advice literature of the period, as essential nightly maintenance, protecting and softening skin that the day's activities, however genteel, still exposed to wind and weather and the general drying effects of coal smoke that hangs, however faintly, in the air of nearly every English interior of this era, wealthy households included. There is a connection here worth drawing back to something we discussed earlier tonight, the Victorian belief linking sufficient rest to a fresh, healthy complexion, because this nightly cold cream ritual reflects the same underlying logic from a different angle, the idea that a woman's appearance required active, ongoing care, rather than simply happening on its own, sleep and skincare working together as 2 complementary halves of the same nightly maintenance, both undertaken with the same quiet seriousness, both understood as simply part of what a lady of Margaret's position owed to her own appearance, and by extension to her family's reputation. Her hair, too, receives its own small additional care beyond the 100 strokes of brushing we described earlier, a few drops of a light almond oil worked through the ends on nights when it has grown particularly dry, a habit inherited, like the cold cream recipe, from her own mother, who inherited it in turn from a grandmother Margaret herself never met, but whose careful nightly habits somehow persist, unchanged in their essential details, across 3 generations of women in this same family. I find these small inherited rituals genuinely touching to think about. Honestly, the way a specific recipe for cold cream, or a specific number of hairbrush strokes, or a specific method of arranging pillows against a bolster can travel quietly down through a family across decades, passed from mother to daughter, or from lady's maid to lady's maid, surviving long after the original person who established the habit has been forgotten, carried forward simply because it works, because it feels right, because this is how it has always been done in this particular family, in this particular room, on this particular kind of ordinary October night. Elsewhere across England tonight, in other country houses and other London townhouses belonging to other families of Margaret's approximate class and means, some version of this exact same evening is unfolding in countless slight variations, other housemaids kneeling at other grates, other ladies' maids brushing other heads of hair, other warming pans sliding beneath other fine linen sheets. The particular details differ from house to house, some families favouring gas lighting even in their bedrooms by this point, some households considerably larger or smaller than Margaret's own, some regions of the country colder or milder than this particular stretch of countryside on this particular October night, but the underlying structure repeats itself with remarkable consistency across the whole wealthy stratum of English society, the same fundamental choreography of invisible labour producing visible comfort, performed simultaneously in hundreds of houses Margaret will never visit, for hundreds of women she will never meet, all of them in their own separate bedrooms tonight, settling towards sleep through some close variation of the exact sequence we have spent this entire night observing in such careful detail. The carpet beneath Margaret's bare feet, mentioned briefly earlier as one small comfort waiting for her each morning, deserves its own moment of attention too, because like nearly everything else in this room, it represents a considerable accumulated investment of both money and craft that Margaret experiences only as simple, unremarkable softness underfoot. It was woven in a mill in the Scottish borders, a thick, densely piled wool carpet in a deep green that echoes the colour of the bed curtains above it, chosen specifically to coordinate with the room's broader scheme during that same redecoration 4 years ago that brought the fern-patterned wallpaper and the wine-coloured counterpane into being. Beneath the visible carpet lies a layer of thick underfelt, itself a considerable expense, chosen specifically to add an extra measure of softness and warmth to the floor. A detail easy to overlook entirely, but one that makes a genuine difference on a cold morning. The difference between stepping onto a floor that feels merely covered and one that feels genuinely, deeply cushioned. Carpets of this quality were, like so much else we have discussed tonight, a marker of real wealth in this era, poorer households making do with bare wooden floorboards, perhaps a small rag rug beside the bed at most, woven from scraps of worn-out clothing too far gone for any other use, providing a token measure of warmth underfoot, but nothing approaching the luxurious depth of Margaret's own carpet. The distance between these two experiences of simply getting out of bed in the morning, one foot landing on thick wool pile, another landing on bare cold wood, captures something essential about this whole story we have spent tonight exploring together. Comfort measured not in grand, dramatic gestures, but in exactly this kind of small, repeated, daily physical experience, multiplied across thousands of mornings into something that shapes an entire life's relationship to comfort itself. On the mantelpiece above the now nearly dead fire sits a small ornamental clock, gilt bronze, a wedding gift from Margaret's husband's aunt that has ticked quietly through every single night of Margaret's married life in this exact spot, its soft mechanical sound so thoroughly woven into the background texture of her sleep that she would likely notice its absence far more readily than she notices its constant, faithful presence. Beside it sits a small framed photograph, a relatively new luxury this decade, showing Margaret's daughter as an infant, taken by a photographer who travelled out from the nearest town with his considerable equipment for the specific purpose of capturing this image, a keepsake that Margaret glances at, most nights, in the last moments before Ellen extinguishes the main lamp, a small private ritual of maternal tenderness that fits easily within the broader pattern of small, repeated, meaningful habits we have traced throughout this entire story. The chair beside the fire, upholstered in that faded green velvet we mentioned earlier during Margaret's reading time, was actually her mother's chair originally, brought to this house as part of Margaret's own dowry when she married, one of the few pieces of furniture in this bedroom that predates the recent redecoration entirely, its slightly worn upholstery and slightly loosened joints, a deliberate exception to the otherwise carefully coordinated newness of the room around it, kept specifically because Margaret could not quite bring herself to replace it with something more fashionable, some small sentimental attachment outweighing, in this one particular case, her usual careful attention to how a room ought to look. I mention these small details, the clock, the photograph, the inherited chair, because I think they matter as much as the fire and the linen and the carefully warmed bed, in explaining why this particular room feels, to Margaret, like genuine comfort rather than merely elaborate provision. A hotel room, however luxuriously appointed, however carefully warmed and turned down each evening by attentive staff, could never quite replicate this exact feeling, because comfort at its deepest level is not simply about temperature and softness. It is about familiarity, about accumulated meaning, about small objects that carry private histories no stranger could ever fully appreciate, and Margaret's bedroom, for all the elaborate invisible labour required to maintain it each night, is genuinely, irreplaceably hers, in a way that no amount of money alone could purchase for someone starting entirely from scratch. It is nearly 5 now, and the sky beyond the curtains, though Margaret cannot see it and would not think to look even if she woke this moment, has shifted from the deep uncertain grey of an hour ago towards something with the faintest beginning suggestion of colour at its eastern edge, a colour too pale and too tentative to properly call dawn yet, more a kind of thinning of the darkness than any true arrival of light. Sarah has already finished rebuilding Margaret's fire by this point, as we described earlier, and has moved on to a handful of other small morning tasks scattered through the family's section of the house, checking that the water jugs in each of the currently unoccupied guest bedrooms remain fresh in case of any unexpected early arrival, though none is expected today, dusting the hall table where the morning post will eventually be laid out for sorting, small unglamorous tasks that fill the gap between the earliest urgent work of fire building and the fuller flurry of activity that will begin once the family properly wakes and the day's real demands begin. Alice, meanwhile, has taken on her own share of these early morning duties, and there is a particular quiet camaraderie between the two young women that develops naturally from sharing both a bedroom and this same demanding early schedule, a friendship built less from long conversation, since there is rarely much time for that, than from simple shared endurance, the mutual understanding of exactly how tired the other one feels at 4:30 in the morning, exactly how welcome a shared cup of tea will feel once their earliest tasks are finally complete, and they can sit together for a few stolen minutes in the servants' hall before the day's fuller demands begin in earnest. Martha, having set the whole morning's rhythm in motion with her own earliest waking and her careful rebuilding of the kitchen fire, has moved on now to supervising the various strands of morning preparation across the household, checking in briefly with the cook about the morning's breakfast menu, confirming with the between maid, a junior position occupied this year by a 14-year-old girl named Bess, who moves between the kitchen and the upstairs work as different tasks require, that the various fires throughout the family's section of the house have all been properly attended to. This kind of quiet, continuous oversight is in its own way as essential to the household's smooth functioning as any single individual task, someone needing to hold the whole complicated morning choreography in mind at once, checking that each piece has happened in its proper order and at its proper time, before the family themselves emerge to find everything, as always, effortlessly ready. The frost on the lawn outside has begun, by this hour, to show its first faint signs of retreat, the very earliest and weakest morning light beginning to soften its hard white edges where it catches the grass most directly, though the deeper shadows beneath the trees along the drive remain thick with unmelted white well into what would eventually become full morning. A single bird, then a second, then gradually a fuller chorus, has begun testing the air with tentative calls from somewhere in the garden's bare hedges, the ordinary daily overture of an English countryside morning building itself gradually louder as more voices join, entirely unconcerned with anything happening inside the walls of the sleeping house nearby. Margaret, still deeply asleep, has perhaps 20 or 30 minutes left before Ellen's knock at her door will begin the gentle process of drawing her back up toward waking, and I find myself thinking about her now in these final quiet minutes of genuine rest, wanting simply to let her have them undisturbed a little longer, this last small stretch of a night that has, by every measure we have spent so long examining together, been exactly what a good night's sleep in a house like this one was designed to be: warm, undisturbed, held, quite literally, in layers of careful fabric and careful fire and careful attention by an entire household working through the dark hours to make certain that when she finally does wake, she will find herself exactly where she fell asleep, exactly as comfortable, exactly as cared for, with the whole night having passed, from her own perspective, as something close to seamless, uninterrupted peace. There is one more small thread worth following before we let this long night finally give way to morning, and it concerns the very fabric of Margaret's nightgown itself, that fine white lawn cotton we described so briefly at the start of tonight's story, because cotton carries its own particular history in this era that is worth acknowledging honestly, even within a story built primarily around comfort and warmth. The raw cotton that eventually became this soft, familiar fabric against Margaret's skin travelled an extraordinarily long distance before reaching the mill where it was spun and woven, grown most likely on plantations in the American South, harvested through labour systems whose brutal history Margaret would have had only the vaguest, most distant awareness of, if any awareness at all, processed and shipped across the Atlantic to feed the enormous cotton mills of Lancashire that had by this point in the century transformed both the English industrial landscape and the everyday material texture of English domestic life, wealthy households and modest ones alike, now clothed and bedded in cotton fabric available at a scale and a price that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations. I mention this not to disrupt the quiet, cosy mood we have built together across this long story, but because I think an honest telling of this era owes at least a passing acknowledgement of how thoroughly even its most intimate, private comforts connected to larger systems of global trade and labour that this household, like most households of its class, rarely examined too closely. The softness of Margaret's nightgown against her skin tonight exists within the same complicated, uneven world we have been tracing all evening, a world where comfort for some rested, in ways both direct and indirect, on considerably harder circumstances for others, some of them living and labouring an ocean away in conditions Margaret would likely never think to imagine at all as she settles beneath her fine linen sheets each night. This is, I think, simply part of holding an honest picture of this era in mind, alongside all the genuine warmth and craft and careful attention we have spent tonight admiring, and I trust you to hold both of these truths together, without either one cancelling out the other, the real skill and real care that built Margaret's comfort, and the real cost, often distant and unacknowledged, that made some parts of that comfort possible in the first place. The sky has properly begun to lighten now, the eastern horizon showing a genuine band of pale gold beneath the retreating grey, and somewhere in the stable yard, the first horse of the morning is being led out for its early exercise by the stable boy, hooves ringing softly against the cold cobblestones, breath visible in small white clouds in the sharp morning air. The household's night, in every practical sense, has ended, even though Margaret herself remains, for these last few precious minutes, exactly where she has been for the past 9 hours, warm and comfortable, and entirely unaware that the whole vast machinery that made her rest possible has already, quietly, without any fanfare at all, turned its full attention toward the day ahead. I want to spend just a little more time, before we finally return fully to Margaret's waking, thinking about the particular sound of this house in these very last minutes before it fully comes alive, because I think it is one of the loveliest, most easily overlooked textures of the entire night we have spent together. There is a particular quality to a large house transitioning from its nighttime stillness into its daytime activity, not a sudden shift but a gradual layering, one small sound joining another, then another, until what began as near total silence has built, almost without anyone noticing the exact moment of transition, into the full ordinary hum of a household fully awake. The first sound tonight was simply Martha's own footsteps on the back stairs, soft but audible in the otherwise complete silence, then the scrape of the kitchen grate being cleared, then the particular clatter of the first kettle being filled and set to heat, then Sarah's own footsteps, lighter than Martha's, moving between the various bedrooms on her early rounds. Then, gradually, voices, low at first, Martha giving some brief instruction to Bess, the cook exchanging a few words with Martha about the morning's menu, each new voice adding itself to the accumulating texture of the house's daily sound. By the time Ellen finally knocks at Margaret's door, this accumulated morning sound will have built to something considerably fuller than the silence that has held the house for most of the past several hours, though still nothing approaching the fuller bustle that will arrive once the family themselves are up and about, once the dining room fills with the particular sounds of breakfast, china and silver and quiet conversation, once the whole day's business properly begins in earnest. There is something almost musical in this gradual layering, if you listen for it the right way, a kind of daily overture that plays out identically, with only minor variation, morning after morning, season after season, year after year, in this house and in countless others like it across the English countryside. I find myself thinking of it sometimes as the sound of comfort itself being rebuilt, each small noise marking one more piece of the previous night's careful architecture being reconstructed fresh for the day ahead, fires relit, water heated, breakfast begun, the whole elaborate system that makes a house like this one feel effortlessly comfortable, simply starting its daily cycle over again, exactly as it started yesterday, exactly as it will start again tomorrow. Margaret, 3 floors below where this whole layered morning symphony has its earliest origins, remains entirely undisturbed by any of it for now, the thick walls and closed doors of her own bedroom absorbing most of these early sounds long before they could reach her sleeping ears, and there is a particular kindness in that architectural fact too, worth noticing, the way this house has been built and arranged specifically to protect its most privileged sleepers from exactly the kind of early morning bustle that the household itself must generate in order to eventually serve them. She will wake, when she finally does wake, not to the sound of a house already busy with work, but to something closer to genuine quiet, a single soft knock, a tray carried carefully so its contents do not rattle, a gentle voice offering good morning, the whole elaborate labour behind her comfortable waking rendered, once again, almost entirely inaudible. I think, sitting with all of this now, in these last quiet minutes before we let Margaret finally wake, about how strange and specific this particular arrangement of comfort actually was, historically speaking, how narrow a window of time it occupied even within England's own long history, let alone the wider world. The grandparents of the servants working in this house tonight would have known a considerably harsher version of English domestic life before the railways made coal and manufactured goods cheap enough to distribute this widely, before the mills of Lancashire and the borders made fine cotton and dense wool carpet available at any scale beyond the wealthiest handful of aristocratic households. And the grandchildren of everyone sleeping in this house tonight, Margaret and Sarah and Ellen and Mrs. Fenwick alike, though none of them could possibly know it yet on this ordinary October night in the 1870s, will live to see this entire elaborate system transformed almost beyond recognition, electricity eventually replacing candle and lamp and even gas, central heating eventually making individual bedroom fires and warming pans feel like curious antiques from a vanished world. The whole vast structure of domestic service itself gradually contracting across the coming decades as economic and social change makes households like this one, with their dozen or more live-in servants, increasingly rare and eventually, within Margaret's own daughter's lifetime, largely a thing of the past. None of that touches this particular night, of course. Tonight exists entirely within its own moment, unaware of what has come before it and unaware of what will eventually replace it. Simply one ordinary October evening, lived fully and completely on its own terms, warm and careful and comfortable in exactly the way this specific era, with its specific technology and its specific social arrangements, made possible for a household of exactly this particular means. I find something worth appreciating in that too, the way every era, including our own, exists this same way, entirely convinced of its own permanence, entirely unaware of how it will eventually look from the vantage point of whatever comes after it. The pale gold light at the eastern horizon has strengthened considerably now, the very first direct rays beginning to catch the tops of the elm trees along the estate's boundary, gilding their bare October branches with a warmth that carries no actual heat yet, simply colour, simply the visual promise of a new day beginning to properly assert itself over the last lingering traces of night. A second horse has joined the first in the stable yard's early exercise, and somewhere beyond the kitchen garden wall, a rooster belonging to the gamekeeper's own small holding has begun its own considerably less musical contribution to the morning's gradually building chorus of sound. And in her own warm bedroom, 3 floors above where all of this quiet activity continues to build toward the day ahead, Margaret shifts one more time in her sleep, drawing slightly closer to full waking without quite reaching it yet, her hand moving unconsciously to pull the counterpane a little higher against the last cool edge of the retreating night, a small automatic gesture of comfort seeking more comfort, exactly the kind of tiny unconscious motion that an entire household's worth of careful labour exists specifically to make possible. Let me tell you a little more about what an ordinary autumn week looks like in this household, stretching just slightly beyond tonight's single evening, because I think it helps complete the picture of how thoroughly this nighttime comfort we have spent so long examining fits within a much larger, equally careful weekly and monthly rhythm. Monday, as I mentioned briefly earlier, brings the Great Wash, an operation that begins before dawn and occupies nearly every pair of hands not otherwise essential to the family's immediate needs. Enormous coppers of water heated and boiled, mountains of linen sorted by type and by degree of soiling, the whole laundry yard behind the kitchen transformed for a full day into something closer to an industrial operation than a domestic one. By Tuesday, much of that same linen hangs drying, weather permitting, on lines strung across the kitchen garden, or before the fires when rain interferes, and by Wednesday, the ironing begins in earnest. Heavy flat irons heated on the kitchen range and tested against a scrap of fabric before being applied to Margaret's fine sheets and pillowcases, a skill requiring real judgment. Too cool an iron leaving fabric limp and unfinished, too hot one risking a scorch mark that could ruin an expensive piece of linen entirely. Thursday and Friday bring their own particular rhythms, mending taking up a considerable portion of the week's remaining domestic labour, torn hems and loosened buttons and worn patches all requiring attention before garments and linens return to full active service, and very little in this household gets discarded quickly or carelessly. The fine fabrics we have discussed tonight representing enough invested value that careful maintenance and repair made far more economic sense than replacement, a household habit of thrift that sits somewhat surprisingly alongside the genuine luxury we have spent tonight describing, though the two are not actually in tension at all, once you understand that Victorian wealth expressed itself as much through careful, considered stewardship of fine possessions as through simple, lavish spending. By the time Saturday arrives, bringing its own lighter round of preparations for the following day's Sunday rest, the linen that left Margaret's bed on Monday morning, worn from a week or more of use, has completed its full cycle and stands ready to return to service, clean, pressed, smelling faintly of the lavender sachets tucked between the folded layers in the linen press, ready to be spread once again across the feather bed we described so carefully at the very beginning of tonight's story, the whole elaborate cycle of comfort beginning fresh, one more time, exactly as it has every single week for as long as anyone in this household can remember. I find this weekly rhythm almost as worth appreciating as the single night we have spent tonight following so closely, because it reveals something important about how comfort actually sustains itself over time, not as a single achievement completed once and then simply maintained effortlessly, but as a continuous cyclical labour, renewed and rebuilt week after week, month after month, by the same patient, skilled hands, applying the same careful attention again and again to the same essential tasks. There is a kind of quiet heroism in that repetition, I think, even though none of the people performing it would ever think to describe their own work in such grand terms. Sarah and Martha and Mrs. Fenwick and all the others simply doing, day after ordinary day, exactly what needs doing, without any particular expectation of recognition or reward beyond their modest weekly wages and whatever private satisfaction comes from a task well and thoroughly completed. The eastern sky has fully brightened now, the pale gold of earlier minutes deepening gradually towards something closer to genuine morning light, though the sun itself remains just below the line of elm trees, its actual rising still a few minutes away. Frost still clings in the deepest shadows beneath the hedges and along the north-facing edge of the garden wall, but across the broader expanse of the lawn it has largely surrendered now to the strengthening light, leaving the grass simply wet and dark, rather than white and crystalline as it appeared just an hour before. There is one final thing worth mentioning before we let this long night complete itself, and it concerns a question I imagine some of you listening tonight might have been quietly turning over across the past several hours, whether a life this thoroughly attended to, this carefully cushioned against every possible discomfort, might have come to feel less like genuine rest and more like a kind of gilded confinement, comfort so total it edges towards something almost suffocating. It is a fair question, and I do not think the honest answer is entirely simple. Margaret herself would likely find the question strange if you put it to her directly, having known no other version of adult life since her marriage, this level of care simply constituting for her the ordinary baseline of existence rather than anything remarkable enough to examine critically. And yet there is real evidence, scattered through the letters and diaries and memoirs, that women of her class and era left behind, that some among them did feel exactly this tension, a gratitude for genuine physical comfort, sitting uneasily alongside a quieter frustration with how thoroughly that comfort was bound up with restriction, with limited independence, with an entire structure of care that also functioned, whether intentionally or not, as a structure of control. I do not think we need to resolve that tension fully tonight, this far into a story meant to carry you gently toward your own sleep, rather than toward difficult unresolved questions about Victorian gender and class. But I think it is worth holding in mind, alongside everything else we have explored, the recognition that Margaret's comfort, real and considerable as it genuinely was, existed within a life that also asked a great deal of her in return, a life of careful self-presentation and limited personal autonomy that the elaborate warmth of her bedroom could soften but never entirely dissolve. What I keep returning to, though, Thinking about all of this now in these final quiet minutes before Margaret finally wakes is simply the care itself, the sheer accumulated attention that so many hands brought to the task of making one woman's ordinary night as comfortable as human skill and available technology could make it. Whatever else was true about the wider structure Margaret lived within, whatever real limitations shaped her days in ways she may or may not have fully recognized, the specific, careful, patient labour we have spent tonight following, fire built and rebuilt, linen washed and warmed, water carried and heated, 100 strokes of a hairbrush repeated with genuine gentleness night after night, represents something worth honouring on its own terms, a very old and very human impulse to care for another person's comfort through small, patient, repeated acts of attention. That impulse existed in Sarah's careful hands as she punched and turned the feather bed. It existed in Ellen's patient brushing, in Martha's early rising, in Mrs. Fenwick's careful management of coal and candle wax stretching back 2 decades, in Mr. Halloran's methodical nightly rounds. And it exists, I think, in whatever brought you to this story tonight too, this same old human impulse, however it shows up in your own life, whether you are the one being cared for tonight, or the one doing the caring, or, as is true for most of us most of the time, some quiet combination of both. The sun, at last, has begun its true rising beyond the elm trees, the first direct rays reaching across the frost-softened lawn and touching the lower windows of the house itself, catching for a moment on the glass of Margaret's own window before the heavy curtain, still drawn, blocks its fuller entry into the room where she continues, for these last few minutes, her long and genuinely peaceful sleep. Birds fill the garden now with their full morning chorus, robins and blackbirds and the occasional thin call of a distant pheasant from the woods beyond the estate's boundary, the whole world outside the house waking into full, ordinary, unremarkable morning. And in the kitchen far below, the cook lifts the first tray of fresh bread from the oven, its warm yeasted smell beginning its slow climb up through the house's staircases and corridors, reaching, eventually, faintly, even as high as the servants' attic rooms where Sarah and Alice, their earliest duties now complete, sit together for a few stolen minutes over their own simple breakfast before the day's fuller demands properly begin. It occurs to me, in these final minutes before we return fully to Margaret's own gentle waking, that there is a particular kind of quiet contentment that settles over a household in exactly this stretch of early morning, after the hardest, coldest, most demanding work of fire building and water heating has been accomplished, but before the fuller, more visible bustle of the family's own day has properly begun. This is the household's own small private hour, in a sense a servant's equivalent of the quiet fireside reading Margaret enjoyed the evening before, a brief pause carved out of an otherwise demanding schedule, taken not because anyone granted it deliberately, but simply because it exists, naturally, in the gap between one set of tasks completed and the next set not yet begun. Sarah stretches her shoulders, sore from the awkward angle of kneeling repeatedly at various grates across the past several hours, and takes a long, grateful sip of tea, strong and well sweetened, the cup warming her still slightly cold hands. Alice, beside her, has already finished her own tea and is picking at the last of a slice of bread, and the two of them talk quietly, briefly, about nothing particularly important, a comment about the cold, a small joke about one of the under-gardeners that makes them both laugh softly enough not to disturb anyone still sleeping nearby, the ordinary, unremarkable conversation of two young women who have known each other closely enough, across shared work and a shared small bedroom, to have developed the easy shorthand of genuine friendship. This small scene, this brief shared cup of tea in the servants' hall at 6:30 in the morning, receives no attention at all in the grander story of this household, no mention in any letter or diary, nothing that would ever be recorded or remembered by anyone beyond the two young women living it. And yet I find myself wanting to linger here for just a moment longer before we finally let this whole long night close, because I think there is something genuinely worth honouring in it, this small pocket of rest and companionship that two hard-working young women manage to claim for themselves within an otherwise demanding schedule, comfort of their own making, however modest, however brief, existing alongside and underneath all the more elaborate comfort we have spent tonight watching them build for someone else. Perhaps that is worth carrying with you too, As this story finally draws toward its close, the recognition that comfort, in whatever form it takes, in whatever life it belongs to, tends to find a way to exist, even in circumstances that offer far less of it than Margaret's own considerable privilege provides. A cup of tea shared quietly between friends, a few stolen minutes of rest, a small joke that makes the cold morning feel briefly less cold. These things matter too, in their own quiet way, every bit as much as feather beds and warming pans and fine Irish linen, even if history rarely thinks to record them with the same careful attention we have spent tonight giving to Margaret's own considerably grander version of an ordinary night's rest. Ellen, meanwhile, has begun her own final preparations before waking Margaret properly, moving quietly through the dressing room adjoining the bedroom, checking one last time that the grey wool morning dress hangs exactly right, that the undergarments warming near the small dressing room fire have not grown too hot to be comfortable, that every small piece of the day's first outfit sits ready and waiting in its proper place. This final check matters more than it might seem to from the outside, because the whole point of everything we have watched happen across this long night is precisely this, that when Margaret finally does open her eyes and eventually rise from her bed, she should encounter no friction at all, no missing piece, no moment of waiting or searching or minor inconvenience to interrupt the smooth, seamless comfort that has characterized her entire night and will now, in these final preparations, characterize her waking too. The tray itself, the one Ellen will carry in shortly, has been assembled with the same careful attention downstairs in the kitchen, the good china chosen specifically for morning service, a particular pattern of small blue flowers that Margaret has always favoured for her earliest cup of the day, the tea itself a blend the household purchases specifically for morning drinking, slightly stronger and more bracing than the more delicate blend served later in the afternoon. Even this small detail, the specific tea chosen for this specific hour, reflects the same careful, considered attention we have traced through every other part of tonight's story. Nothing left to chance, nothing assembled carelessly, every small choice made with genuine thought toward exactly what will bring the most comfort and pleasure to the person it is intended for. Outside, the sun has now properly cleared the line of elm trees, its full morning light spreading across the lawn and catching, for the first time this morning, the upper windows of the house itself, Margaret's own window among them, though the heavy curtain within continues to hold back most of that brightening light, preserving for just a few minutes longer the gentle, low-lit quality of the room where she still sleeps. The frost has entirely surrendered now across the open lawn, though it lingers still in a few final shadowed corners, beneath the box hedges, along the base of the garden wall, small stubborn patches of white that will themselves disappear within the hour as the sun climbs fully clear of the trees and begins its own patient work of warming the whole visible world outside. The birds have reached their fullest morning chorus now, a rich, layered sound of a dozen different calls overlapping, robins and thrushes, and the persistent, cheerful racket of a small flock of sparrows that have made their home in the ivy climbing the kitchen wall, and somewhere beneath all of that bird-song, faint but real, the ordinary daily sounds of the house itself have built to their own fuller morning volume. Footsteps on stairs, the distant clatter of crockery being laid for breakfast, a door opening somewhere and closing again, the whole household now genuinely, fully awake and moving through its established morning rhythm, with the same practiced ease it brings to every other part of its daily and nightly cycle. Ellen straightens the tray one final time, checks her own appearance briefly in the small mirror above the washstand in the dressing room, and moves toward Margaret's door. And in this last quiet moment before she knocks, I find myself wanting to hold everything we have learnt together across this whole long story, the fire and the linen and the warming pan, the careful hands and the invisible labour, the whole vast patient machinery of an 1870s English country house, working through an entire night to produce exactly this single, small, unremarkable, deeply comfortable moment. One woman about to wake gently in a warm room, entirely unaware of how much careful human effort made that gentleness possible, and entirely, genuinely, deserving of the peace she is about to wake into all the same. There is a very particular stillness that settles over a room in these last few seconds before someone knocks at its door, a stillness Margaret herself will never consciously register since she remains, for now, entirely asleep, but one worth noticing all the same, the whole elaborate night finally converging toward its natural, gentle conclusion. The fire Sarah rebuilt hours ago burns steadily now, well established, filling the room with a warmth considerably more generous than the low-banked glow it held through the deepest hours of the night. The counterpane, rumpled from a full night's genuine rest, still holds its rich wine colour in the strengthening light beginning to seep faintly around the curtain's edges. The book from the previous evening sits closed and undisturbed on its small table, marking a place Margaret will likely not return to until this same hour tomorrow night, when the whole careful sequence we have followed across this entire story begins, once again its patient, familiar, endlessly repeated work. Somewhere below, a clock strikes the half-hour, its soft chime carrying up through the house's staircases and corridors with the same muffled, distant quality it has carried every single morning of Margaret's 11 years in this house, and Ellen, hearing it, raises her hand and knocks gently at the bedroom door. 2 soft knocks, a small pause, and then, without waiting for any answer that would not come from a woman still genuinely asleep, she turns the handle and steps quietly inside, carrying the tray with its small blue-flowered china and its pot of freshly steeped tea, ready to begin the same gentle, familiar sequence that will ease Margaret from sleep into waking exactly as carefully as everything else in this house was arranged, across this whole long night, to ease her from waking into sleep. This is where we will leave her, in this warm room filled now with early morning light and the smell of fresh tea, an entire household's night of careful, patient, largely invisible labour finally arriving at its quiet, unremarkable, deeply satisfying conclusion. Tomorrow night, this same sequence begins again, fire built, bed warmed, water heated, and Margaret will climb once more into this same comfortable bed, entirely unaware, as she has always been, of exactly how much careful human effort makes her rest possible, and entirely, genuinely at peace within it all the same. I think, in the end, that is really the whole quiet lesson tucked inside tonight's long story, one worth carrying gently with you as your own eyes grow heavy now, wherever you happen to be listening from. Comfort was never simple in this house, never automatic, never something that simply happened on its own. It was built deliberately and carefully, hour by hour, hand by hand, by people whose own nights looked nothing like the one we have spent so long following tonight. And yet that labour, however unevenly distributed, however invisible to the person it ultimately served, was carried out with genuine skill, genuine attention, and more often than not, something that looked remarkably like genuine care. Perhaps that is worth remembering the next time you settle into your own bed, wherever and whenever that happens to be. This small, quiet picture of an old English house working patiently through the dark hours to hold one woman safely, warmly, gently through an entire long night of rest. By 6 in the morning, the sky beyond Margaret's curtains has brightened considerably, though the sun itself has not yet cleared the line of elm trees at the eastern edge of the estate, and the light filtering faintly around the edges of the heavy curtains has shifted from grey to something closer to pale gold. The frost on the lawn outside has begun, almost imperceptibly, to soften at its edges where the earliest warmth of the coming day has started to reach it. Downstairs, the household's morning has moved well past its first quiet stirrings into something approaching full, purposeful activity. The dining room has been laid for breakfast, though the family will not appear there for some hours yet, the sideboard prepared with covered dishes that will be refreshed closer to the actual hour of eating. The morning post has already been sorted by the butler, who rose not long after Martha, and has spent the intervening time attending to the small daily rituals of his own considerable responsibilities, checking the wine cellar's temperature, reviewing the day's expected deliveries, ensuring the newspapers when they arrive from the nearest station will be pressed and ready for whoever wants them first. Ellen, Margaret's own lady's maid, has been awake since shortly after 5, and her morning routine mirrors the evenings in reverse, though compressed into a shorter window of time. She has already selected and laid out the day's clothing, a morning dress in a soft grey wool, suitable for whatever ordinary domestic activities the day will bring. undergarments warmed briefly near the newly built fire in the small dressing room adjoining Margaret's bedroom, stockings and shoes arranged with the same careful attention that characterized every object placed in the bedroom the night before. There is a kind of symmetry in this that I find genuinely satisfying to think about, the way the household's labor curves around a full day like two matching halves of the same careful design, undressing mirrored by dressing, the fire lit at evening mirrored by the fire rebuilt at dawn, warmth offered at bedtime mirrored by warmth waiting at waking. At 6:30, Ellen knocks softly at Margaret's door, waits a moment, and enters carrying a small tray, the same kind of tray that would be prepared whether Margaret wakes on her own or needs gentle rousing, holding a pot of tea already steeping, a single cup and saucer, a small jug of milk, and nothing else, since breakfast proper will come later once Margaret has dressed and made her way downstairs. Margaret stirs at the sound of the door, surfacing slowly from sleep the way a person does after a genuinely restful night, without the jarring disorientation of an alarm or an urgent summons, simply drifting upward through the last thin layer of a dream until her eyes open on the familiar shapes of her own bedroom, now lit by the fresh fire Sarah built hours earlier and by the pale, growing daylight seeping around the edges of the curtains. Here is the sensation I think about most, honestly, when I picture this exact moment, the specific comfort of waking slowly, in your own time, in a room already warm, already prepared, with nothing at all required of you except to open your eyes and decide you are ready to begin the day. No cold shock of an unheated room, no urgency, no sound of an alarm clock, an invention that exists already in this era but has not yet made its way into a household like this one, where servants simply handle the function an alarm clock would later serve, waking early enough themselves to ensure the family never needs one at all. Ellen crosses to the window and draws back the heavy curtains, and the room floods, gradually, with the pale gold light of a proper English autumn morning, revealing the wallpaper's fern pattern in full colour again, the dressing table's silver brushes catching a faint gleam, the wine-coloured counterpane, rumpled now from a full night's sleep, glowing warmly in the new daylight. Margaret pushes herself up against her pillows, still propped at their familiar angle against the bolster, and Ellen pours the tea, and for a few minutes, exactly as happened the night before beside the dying fire with her book, Margaret exists in a small pocket of unhurried privacy, tea warm in her hands, the room around her comfortable and quiet, before the demands and performances of the day properly begin. She notices, the way she notices most mornings without ever really commenting on it, that the fire is already burning steadily, that the room is already warm despite the frost still visible on the lawn outside, that everything she might want within the first few minutes of waking has simply already been provided. It occurs to her, this particular morning, perhaps because of some fleeting half-remembered dream, to wonder briefly how early someone must have risen to make all of this ready before she herself woke, and the thought passes through her mind and out again within a few seconds, acknowledged rather than dwelt upon, the way most of us, if we are honest, acknowledge the invisible labour that smooths our own lives without spending very long actually sitting with it. I do not say this critically. It is simply the shape of the world Margaret was born into, and the world she will likely occupy for the rest of her life, and there is no particular use in imagining she should feel constant guilt over the comfort she was raised to expect and has never known any alternative to. What I find more interesting, honestly, is the sheer scale of coordinated human effort required to produce something that, from the inside, feels this effortless. An entire household, a dozen or more people across several ranks and roles, spent the previous evening and the earliest hours of this morning working in careful, mostly silent coordination toward exactly one outcome: that Margaret would sleep warmly, wake gently, and never once need to think about how either of those things came to be true. Downstairs, by now the smell of bacon and fresh bread has fully filled the kitchen and begun drifting up the back stairs toward the servants' quarters, where Sarah and Alice, their own morning tasks mostly complete for this particular stretch of the day, will soon sit down to their own breakfast, plainer than what will eventually appear on Margaret's plate, but hearty enough, taken standing or seated at the long scrubbed table in the servants' hall, a brief pause in a day that began for them nearly 2 hours before it began for the family they serve. The child in the nursery has woken too by now, cheerful in the particular unguarded way young children often are first thing in the morning, and the nursery maid is already helping her dress for the day, small buttons fastened by patient adult hands, hair brushed and tied with a fresh ribbon, breakfast of bread and milk waiting on a low table sized for a child rather than an adult. Somewhere in all of this ordinary, repeated, unremarkable activity, an entire household has once again completed the full cycle it completes every single day of the year, comfort dismantled at dawn and rebuilt by evening, only to be dismantled again the following morning and rebuilt once more the evening after that, an endless careful rhythm that most of the people benefiting from it will never once stop to fully see. Margaret finishes her tea, sets the cup back on its saucer, and swings her legs over the edge of the bed, her bare feet finding the soft warmth of the carpet rather than cold bare floor, because even this small detail, a good thick carpet extending generously beneath the bed, was chosen and installed years ago with exactly this moment in mind. Her slippers wait exactly where they waited the night before, and she slides her feet into them without needing to look down, a motion so familiar it requires no attention at all, and crosses toward the dressing table where Ellen is already laying out the morning's first small necessities. The fire crackles pleasantly in the grate behind her. The last of the frost on the lawn outside is beginning to melt in the strengthening morning light, and somewhere below, the enormous quiet machinery of the house, having spent all night and all the earliest hours of the morning building exactly this moment, this warm, unhurried, entirely comfortable beginning to Margaret's day, has already, without pause, turned its full attention toward building the next one. This is what a night of sleep actually was, in a house like this one, in England, in the 1870s. Not simply the absence of wakefulness, not merely 8 hours spent unconscious in a bed. It was an entire structure, built from coal and linen and feathers and firelight and the quiet, coordinated labor of a dozen people whose own comfort rarely matched what they worked so carefully to provide for someone else. It was warmth created rather than found. It was softness accumulated across years of careful washing and turning and mending. It was privacy carved out of an otherwise thoroughly observed existence, one quiet hour beside a fire with a book, one long unbroken stretch of rest beneath layers of fine linen and heavy wool and quilted silk. And somewhere in all of that, underneath the corsets and the calling cards and the elaborate rules of Victorian social life that we tend to remember most vividly when we picture this era, there was this: a bed, a fire, a warm jug of water waiting in the morning, a cup of tea brought quietly to a woman just opening her eyes to a new day. Small things really when you list them out like that, and yet somehow taken together they added up to something that felt, and still feels, whenever I think carefully about it, like one of the gentlest and most genuinely human parts of an era otherwise so often remembered for its formality and its distance. Margaret's day is only just beginning now, out there in the pale gold light of an October morning, and there will be letters to write and calls to receive, and all the small formal architecture of her particular life to move through before this same room, this same bed, waits for her again tonight, warmed again, turned down again, ready again, by hands she will likely never think to thank because she has never known a version of comfort that required her to notice them at all. That you, listening now, wherever you are tonight, in whatever bed you have carried yourself into, I hope you noticed. I hope some small part of tonight's story stays with you as your own eyes grow heavy, this quiet picture of a house working through the dark hours to build warmth around a sleeping woman, fire by fire, blanket by blanket, one careful hand after another. There is something worth carrying into your own sleep in that image, I think. The idea that comfort, wherever it comes from, however it arrives, is always in some sense built, and that tonight, in your own bed, whatever hands built the comfort around you, whether your own or someone else's, you are allowed to simply receive it the way Margaret received hers, without guilt, without effort, without anything at all required of you now except to let your eyes close. Sleep well. I will see you again next time, here in Sleepy Old World.